Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most beautiful lies. Picture this: Paris 1900. The World Fair glitters with electric lights. Women glide through ballrooms in gowns worth more than entire villages. Champagne flows like rivers. Everyone is smiling. But here is what they never tell you. Behind every silk gown, behind every diamond tiara, behind every perfect smile, there was a woman trapped in a cage made of gold. And tonight, you will discover why wealth, power, and privilege could not save them from the darkness that was coming. So before we step into this glittering world together, I want to ask you something. If you find yourself drawn into this story, if the lives of these forgotten women touch something inside you, would you take just a moment to subscribe to this channel? Maybe hit that like button, or share this with someone who loves real history, the kind they never taught us in school. And I am genuinely curious, where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you in bed, letting the darkness wrap around you? Are you driving through empty streets? Drop a comment and tell me. I love knowing that we are sharing this moment, wherever you are in the world. Now, let us dim the lights, let the night settle around us, and travel back to a time when everything looked perfect, but nothing was. Paris, the year 1900. The Exposition Universelle, that is what they called the World Fair, has just opened, and the entire world is watching. 50 million people will visit before it closes. They come to see the future, the moving sidewalk, the palace of electricity, and most stunning of all, the Grand Palais, dripping with crystal and gold. This is La Belle Époque, the beautiful era. The phrase sounds like poetry, doesn't it? Like something from a fairy tale. But here is the thing about fairy tales. They are beautiful because they hide the darkness, and in 1900 there was so much darkness hidden beneath the silk and satin. Let me paint you a picture of what life looked like for the women at the very top of society. Imagine you are born into one of Europe's great families. Your nursery overlooks manicured gardens. Your first words are probably in French, the language of refinement. You've never touched a coin, never washed your own hair, never once wondered where your next meal will come from. Sounds wonderful, right? But here is the catch, and it is a big one. You're not actually a person. Not really. You're an investment, a beautiful object, a bargaining chip in a game played by men you barely know. And the rules of this game, you never get to see them until it is far too late. The numbers tell a story that is almost hard to believe. In England alone, one of the wealthiest nations on earth, only one person in 17 actually belonged to what they called high society. 1 in 17. That means out of every 100 people walking the streets of London, barely 6 of them had access to the world of country estates and London townhouses, and summers in Monte Carlo. But here is the strange part. That tiny fraction controlled everything. The fashion, the culture, the rules about how people should live and love and even think. And the women in this world, they were the most controlled of all. Let me tell you about someone real. Her name was Archduchess Matilda of Austria, and her story breaks my heart every single time I think about it. She was born in 1849 into the Habsburg family. You know, the people with bloodlines so complicated they needed charts just to figure out who they were allowed to marry. Matilda had everything. Palaces, jewels, servants, the finest education money could buy. At 18 years old, she was engaged to Prince Umberto of Savoy, who would one day become the King of Italy. Her entire future was planned out like a perfectly choreographed dance. But Matilda was still just a teenager, still a girl trying to figure out who she was. And like many teenagers throughout history, she wanted to rebel in her own small way. So one afternoon in 1867, she did something that seems so innocent to us now, so utterly harmless, that it is almost funny. Except it is not funny at all. She smoked a cigarette. Now, you have to understand, in 1867, a young aristocratic woman smoking was not just frowned upon. It was considered shocking, unladylike, improper, the kind of thing that could damage your reputation, ruin your engagement, bring shame on your entire family. So when Matilda heard her father's footsteps coming down the hallway, her strict Prussian father, who would have been horrified to catch her, she did what any panicked teenager would do. She hid the cigarette behind her back. She was wearing a light summer gown, the kind made of layers and layers of delicate fabric, the kind that flowed and billowed and looked absolutely gorgeous in portrait paintings. The cigarette touched the fabric, and Matilda burned to death. Right there in her room, in front of her family, screaming, 18 years old, engaged to be a queen, dead because she was afraid to disappoint her father. I want you to sit with that for a moment. This was a girl who had every privilege in the world. Wealth beyond measure, beauty, status, a future as royalty. And she died because she was more terrified of her father's disapproval than she was of fire. That is the world we are talking about tonight. A world where women lived in constant fear. Fear of gossip, fear of scandal, fear of making one wrong move that could ruin everything. And the thing is, Matilda's story is not even unusual. It is just one of thousands of stories about women who had everything, except freedom, except choices, except the right to be human and make mistakes and still be okay. Let me give you another set of numbers that really puts this in perspective. In 1900, if you were a wealthy woman in London and you wanted to participate in the season, that is what they called the summer social calendar, you needed to budget between £3,000 and £5,000 just for the wardrobe. Now that might not sound like much until you realise that the average working class family in England at the time earned about £50 per year. So these women were spending the equivalent of 100 years of a worker's salary just on clothes for a few months of parties. But it gets better. Or worse, depending on how you look at it. The season was not actually about having fun. It was a marriage market. A place where young women, girls really, most of them between 18 and 21, were paraded in front of eligible men like horses at an auction. Their mothers would calculate their worth. How much land did they have? What connections? How much money would they bring to a marriage? How pretty were they? How well could they dance? How charming was their conversation? And if you did not get married during your first season, well, you came back the next year and the next, each year a little more desperate, a little more pitied. After 3 or 4 seasons without a proposal, people started to whisper, "Poor dear, still available, must be something wrong with her." By your mid-20s, if you were still unmarried, you were considered a failure or a burden, someone to be quietly shuffled off to become a companion to an elderly relative, or maybe, if you were lucky, a governess in someone else's home. Your entire worth as a human being came down to whether a man chose you. That was it. That was the entire game. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. You might be thinking, well, at least they had beautiful lives. At least they wore gorgeous dresses and went to incredible parties and lived in palaces. And yes, that is true. The surfaces of their lives were spectacular, breathtaking even. But let me tell you what no one talks about. Let me tell you about the other side of all that beauty. In 1839, so 60 years before our story begins, England passed something called the Custody of Infants Act. And you know what that act said? It said that mothers of unblemished character could finally have access to their own children if a marriage fell apart. Access. Not custody, not rights, just access. Before 1839, if your marriage ended for any reason, your husband automatically got the children. You could be the most loving, devoted mother in the world, and it did not matter. You had no legal claim to your own babies. That act was considered revolutionary, progressive, a huge step forward for women's rights. But here is the thing that really gets me. Even after the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, which supposedly gave women more access to divorce, the law was still completely stacked against them. A man could divorce his wife simply by proving she'd committed adultery. That was it. One affair, and he could leave, keep the children, keep the money, keep everything. But if a woman wanted to divorce her husband, she had to prove not just adultery, but adultery plus incest, or adultery plus bigamy, or adultery plus cruelty, or adultery plus desertion. And here is the truly twisted part. If the wife had permitted the incest or bigamy or desired the cruelty, then it did not count. The law literally assumed that women might want to be treated cruelly, and if they did, well, that was their problem. This was the legal reality for the women we are talking about tonight. Women with money, with titles, with every advantage society could offer. And still they had no real power, no real protection, no real way out if things went wrong. Imagine living your entire life knowing that one wrong move, one scandal, one whisper of impropriety, and you could lose your children forever. Imagine knowing that the man you married, chosen by your parents, probably someone you barely knew, had complete legal ownership of you. Your body, your money, your future, your babies. That is the cage we are talking about. It was made of gold and diamonds and silk, yes, but it was still a cage. And in 1900, standing on the edge of a new century, with electric lights illuminating the streets of Paris and everyone talking about progress and modernity and the bright future ahead, these women were still trapped inside it. They could see the bars, they could feel them, but they could not break free, not yet. You know what fascinates me most about this era? It is the contrast, the absolute stunning contrast between appearance and reality. If you look at photographs from La Belle Époque, and there are thousands of them, because photography was becoming more accessible and popular, you see these incredible images of women who look like goddesses, their hair piled high in elaborate updos decorated with jewels, their gowns made of layers and layers of lace and silk and satin, each one taking hundreds of hours to create by hand, their waists so tiny they almost do not look real. And actually, they were not real, but we will talk more about that in the next part of our story. Everything in these photographs screams wealth and power and control. These women look untouchable, invincible, like they are living in a completely different universe from the rest of humanity. But if you could step through those photographs, if you could somehow travel back and actually talk to these women, I think you would be shocked by what you found. Because behind the perfect posture and the carefully arranged smiles, there was fear, there was loneliness, there was a desperate, aching awareness that everything could fall apart at any moment, and when it did, they would have absolutely no power to save themselves. Their wealth could buy them beautiful things, it could buy them comfort and luxury and leisure, it could buy them the finest doctors and the most skilled servants and the most exquisite jewels in the world. But it could not buy them safety, it could not buy them freedom, it could not buy them the right to choose their own futures. And in just 14 more years, in the summer of 1914, that whole glittering world was going to come crashing down in ways that no one could have predicted. But that is a story for later in our journey. For now, I want you to hold on to this image, a girl named Matilda, 18 years old, burning to death because she was afraid to disappoint her father, the flames consuming her expensive gown, the one that made her look so perfect, so untouchable, so completely in control, because that is the truth about La Belle Époque. It looked beautiful from the outside, it looked perfect, but it was built on suffering and control and the systematic breaking of women's spirits. And we are just beginning to uncover how deep that suffering went. In our next part, we're going to talk about something that honestly makes me feel a little sick every time I research it. The actual physical torture these women endured every single day in the name of beauty. The corsets, the breathing problems, the broken bones, and the shocking reality that doctors at the time knew exactly what was happening and did not care. But that is a story for the next part of our journey together. For now, I want you to think about the women we have met tonight. Think about Mathilde. Think about all those girls at the season, smiling and dancing while their mothers negotiated their futures like they were livestock. Think about the mothers who lost their children because the law said they had no rights. And ask yourself, if wealth and power could not save them, what does that tell us about the world they lived in? What does that tell us about the real price of beauty, of status, of fitting into a system that was never designed to let them be free? Stay with me. We have so much more to uncover together. I want to talk to you about something that honestly makes my stomach turn every time I dive into the research. We are going to discuss what these women did to their own bodies, or more accurately, what society forced them to do in the name of beauty. And I am warning you right now, some of what you're about to hear is going to sound like medieval torture, except this was not the Middle Ages. This was 1900. This was the so-called modern era. This was the time of electric lights and automobiles and telephones. And women were still breaking their own ribs to fit into the perfect silhouette. Let me introduce you to something called the S-bend corset. Now, if you know anything about Victorian fashion, you might be thinking, oh, corsets, I have heard about those. But trust me, what I'm about to tell you goes so far beyond what most people understand about these contraptions that it feels like discovering a horror story hiding inside a fashion magazine. The S-bend corset became popular in the late 1890s and dominated fashion throughout the Edwardian era. And when I say it changed the shape of women's bodies, I do not mean it in some gentle aesthetic way. I mean it literally forced the human skeleton into a position it was never meant to hold. Here is how it worked. The corset had a long, rigid busk, that is a flat piece of wood or steel, that ran down the front of the body. This busk forced the hips backward and pushed the bust forward, creating what they called the pouter pigeon silhouette. From the side, a woman's body formed a perfect S-curve, chest thrust forward, backside pushed out, waist compressed in the middle so tightly that some women achieved measurements that seemed physically impossible, and I mean that literally. There are documented cases of aristocratic women with 18-inch waists. 18 inches. Let that sink in for a moment. The average waist size for an adult woman today is somewhere between 27 and 33 inches, depending on height and build. These women were compressing their natural waist size by almost half. Now you might be wondering, how is that even possible? How can a human body do that without, dying? The answer is it could not without serious, permanent damage. Let me tell you about Princess Alexandra of Wales, who later became Queen Alexandra when her husband Edward took the throne in 1901. Alexandra was famous, absolutely legendary for her beauty and her fashion sense. She set trends that women across Europe tried desperately to copy, and her waist, 18 inches, maybe even smaller on some occasions, depending on which historical accounts you believe. But here is what they do not tell you in the fashion histories. Here is what gets left out of the beautiful oil paintings and the glossy photographs. Alexandra had chronic health problems her entire adult life. She walked with a limp. Some historians say it was from rheumatic fever as a child, but others point out that the timing coincides suspiciously with when she started serious corseting. She suffered from breathing difficulties. She had digestive problems that plagued her for decades. She was often in pain, and she was not alone, not even close. Medical journals from the period, and yes, doctors were eating about this, they knew exactly what was happening, documented something they called corset liver. That is an actual medical term, corset liver. It referred to the way that tight lacing deformed the liver, pushing it down and to the side, sometimes actually changing its shape permanently. Women also developed what doctors called floating ribs, ribs that had been compressed so intensely for so long that they became detached from the sternum and just kind of floated around inside the torso, pressing on organs, causing chronic pain. I want you to imagine that for a second. Imagine your own ribs, bones that are supposed to protect your vital organs, becoming so damaged that they start floating around inside your body like debris. And this was not happening to a few unfortunate women with bad corsets. This was happening to thousands upon thousands of women across Europe and America. This was normal, expected, required, because here is the thing about the S-bend corset, it was not optional. If you were an aristocratic woman, if you moved in high society, you wore the corset. Every single day, from the moment you woke up until the moment you went to bed. And sometimes, women even slept in lighter versions of their corsets to maintain their shape overnight. The process of getting dressed was an ordeal that took hours. A lady's maid, and wealthy women always had at least one lady's maid, would begin by helping her mistress into her undergarments. Then came the corset. The maid would position it around the woman's torso, then begin the process of lacing it tight. And I mean tight. The woman being corseted would hold onto a bedpost or a piece of furniture while her maid pulled the laces, bracing her foot against the woman's back for leverage. Pull, tighten, until the woman could barely breathe. And that was just the beginning of getting dressed. After the corset came layers and layers of other garments, petticoats, the dress itself, often weighing 20 pounds or more, accessories, jewellery. The entire outfit could weigh 30 to 40 pounds. 40 pounds. That is like wearing a small child on your body all day long. But wait, it gets worse. Because the S-bend corset did not just compress the waist. It also did something truly diabolical to women's ability to breathe. You see, when you or I breathe normally, our diaphragm moves down, our ribcage expands, our lungs fill with air. It is automatic, natural. Your body has been doing it since the moment you were born. But when you are wearing an S-bend corset laced tight enough to create that fashionable silhouette, your ribcage cannot expand, your diaphragm cannot move properly. So women had to learn a completely different way of breathing, shallow breaths from the upper chest only, panting almost like a dog on a hot day. This is why fainting was so common among Victorian and Edwardian women. It was not because they were delicate or weak or overly emotional, no matter what the men of the time wanted to believe. It was because they literally could not get enough oxygen. They were slowly suffocating inside their own clothes. And here is something that really gets me. Here is the part that makes me so angry I can barely keep my voice calm. The women knew, the doctors knew, everyone knew that this was causing permanent damage, chronic pain, serious health problems. There were entire reform movements dedicated to convincing women to stop wearing corsets, or at least to wear them more loosely. There were doctors publishing papers with titles like The Evils of Tight Lacing, and On the Deformity of the Thorax Caused by Fashion. But fashion won, every single time, because a woman who did not wear a corset, who could not achieve that perfect S-curve silhouette, was not fashionable. And in high society, not being fashionable was a kind of social death. You would not be invited to the right parties. You would not attract the right marriage proposals. You would be whispered about, pitied, excluded. So women kept wearing them. They kept lacing themselves into these instruments of torture every single morning. They kept fainting and gasping and suffering through chronic pain, because the alternative, being seen as unfashionable, as not trying hard enough, as not beautiful enough, was somehow worse. Let me give you another number that illustrates just how insane this all was. A fashionable woman in Edwardian high society was expected to change her clothes 4 to 6 times per day. 4 to 6 times. That means going through the entire process of unlacing the corset, removing all the layers, putting on a completely new outfit, relacing the corset, arranging all the accessories, 4 to 6 times every single day. Morning dress for breakfast, walking dress for going out, afternoon dress for receiving visitors, tea gown for tea time, dinner dress for dinner, evening gown for any social events, and if you attended a ball or a really formal occasion, you might change even more times than that. Each change took at least 30 minutes, often closer to an hour. That means wealthy women were spending 3 to 6 hours per day just changing their clothes, not wearing them, not enjoying them, just the mechanical process of putting them on and taking them off. Can you imagine? Can you imagine spending that much of your life just dealing with your clothing? And remember, these women could not do this alone. They needed their ladies' maids. They were physically dependent on another person just to get dressed in the morning. That is a kind of helplessness, a kind of vulnerability that I think is hard for us to truly understand today. Now you might be thinking, surely someone must have rebelled against this, right? Surely some women must have said, you know what, forget this. I am not breaking my ribs for fashion. And you would be right. There were rebels. There were women who pushed back, but let me tell you what happened to them. There was a movement in the late 1800s and early 1900s called the rational dress movement. These were women, and some sympathetic men, who argued that women's fashion should be, well, rational, comfortable, healthy. They promoted looser corsets, or no corsets at all. They designed alternative clothing that allowed women to move and breathe freely. Some of them even advocated for women wearing trousers, scandalous at the time. And you know what happened? They were mocked, ridiculed. Cartoons in newspapers and magazines portrayed them as ugly, mannish, desperate spinsters who could not attract a husband, so they were giving up on femininity altogether. Their movement was treated like a joke. Because here is the really dark truth at the heart of all of this. The corset was not really about beauty. It was about control. Think about it. When you cannot breathe properly, you cannot run, you cannot fight, you cannot do any kind of strenuous physical activity. You are forced to move slowly, carefully, delicately. You are forced to rely on others, to hold on to a man's arm when you walk, to sit down frequently, to avoid anything that might cause you to need more oxygen than your compressed lungs can provide. The corset made women physically dependent. It made them weak, and weakness in that world was seen as feminine, desirable, proper. A woman who could breathe freely, who could run, who could lift heavy things, who had full use of her body, that was threatening. That suggested strength, independence, the possibility that she might not need a man to take care of her. So society convinced women that slowly destroying their own bodies was not just fashionable, but necessary, moral, a sign of good breeding and proper femininity. And the women who made these corsets, let me tell you about them, because this is where the story gets even darker. While wealthy women were paying hundreds of pounds for custom-made corsets, and believe me, a well-made sebend corset from a top maker could cost as much as a working-class family earned in a year, there were other women hunched over sewing tables in dimly lit workshops, stitching these garments together by hand. These were the seamstresses, the invisible women, the ones who made the beautiful things but could never afford to wear them. They worked 16, sometimes 18 hours a day. Their wages, 6 pence per week on average, 6 pence. That is about 50 cents in today's American money. Except that's not even close to a fair comparison, because 50 cents went a lot further in 1900 than it does now, but still it was barely enough to survive on. The working conditions in these garment factories and workshops were brutal. The women sat in cramped spaces with inadequate lighting, straining their eyes to create perfect stitches on layer after layer of fabric. The air was full of fabric dust and fibres that destroyed their lungs. Their hands became permanently deformed from the repetitive motions of sewing. Many of them went blind before they were 40 years old. And here is the cruel irony that I want you to really think about. These seamstresses were making corsets that would destroy the health of wealthy women, but they themselves were being destroyed in a different way, ground down by poverty and labour, instead of squeezed by whalebone and steel. Two groups of women both being crushed by the same system, neither able to escape. The wealthy woman in her corset could barely breathe, could barely move, was in constant pain, had broken ribs and displaced organs. But she was considered beautiful, desirable, successful. She had achieved the perfect silhouette. The seamstress who made that corset could breathe fine. Her lungs were not compressed. But she was breathing in fabric dust and working in darkness and slowly. She was invisible, worthless in the eyes of society, just another body to use up and discard, both trapped, both suffering, both powerless to change the system that was destroying them. You know what really haunts me about all of this is how long it lasted. It is how many generations of women went through this before anything changed. We are talking about decades, no centuries of women systematically damaging their own bodies because they'd been convinced that this was normal, that this was necessary, that this was what it meant to be a proper woman. And when World War I finally came in 1914, and we will talk much more about that later in our journey, one of the first things that changed was fashion. Women needed to work in factories, needed to serve as nurses, needed to move and breathe and function. And suddenly, magically, the impossible became possible. Women started wearing simpler clothes, looser clothes. The corset industry collapsed almost overnight, which tells you everything you need to know, doesn't it? The corset was never necessary. It was never about health or beauty or any of the things society claimed. It was about keeping women weak, keeping them dependent, keeping them controllable. And it took a war that killed millions of people to finally break that particular cage. But we are not there yet. We are still in La Belle Époque, still in the beautiful era. Still in the time when everything looks perfect on the surface, and we have so much more to uncover about the reality behind that perfect surface. In the next part of our journey, we are going to talk about the marriage market, and when I say market, I mean it literally. We are going to talk about actual dollar amounts, or pound amounts, I should say. We are going to talk about how American heiresses were sold to British aristocrats in deals that would make a modern corporate merger look simple. We are going to talk about girls who were locked in rooms until they agreed to marry men they had never met. We are going to talk about what happened when wealth from the New World collided with titles from the Old World, and how the women caught in the middle paid the price. Stay with me. This story gets darker before it gets lighter, but I promise you it is worth knowing. These women deserve to be remembered, not as beautiful objects in old photographs, but as real people who suffered, who endured, who survived in a world that saw them as nothing more than decorative investments. Their stories matter, and we are just beginning to understand how much. There is a moment in history that I find absolutely fascinating, and it involves a locked room, a crying girl, and a mother who was willing to destroy her own daughter's life to climb one more rung on the social ladder. This is the story of what happened when money met aristocracy, when New World wealth crashed into Old World titles, and when young women discovered that being rich meant absolutely nothing if you were also female. Let me take you to New York City in the 1890s. America is booming. The Industrial Revolution has created a whole new class of people who are richer than anyone has ever been in human history. We are talking about families with names like Vanderbilt, Astor, Morgan, Carnegie. These are people who own railroads, steel mills, banks, and entire industries. They have so much money, they literally do not know what to do with it all. But here is the problem, and it is a big one. In America, especially in New York high society, there is a very clear pecking order. The old families, the ones who came over on the Mayflower or made their fortunes before the Civil War, they are at the top. They are the ones who decide who gets invited to which parties, who is acceptable, who belongs. And the new money families? The ones who just made their fortunes in the last generation or two. They are looked down upon, snubbed, treated like people who are trying too hard. It does not matter how many millions of dollars you have. If you do not have the right family name, the right connections, the right bloodline, you are still an outsider. So these incredibly wealthy families came up with a solution. A trade. A deal that would make everyone happy. Well, almost everyone. They would send their daughters to Europe, specifically to England, and they would buy them titles. I am not speaking metaphorically here. I mean they literally bought aristocratic titles for their daughters by marrying them off to broke British nobles. It was a system so blatant, so transactional that people actually had a phrase for it. They called it cash for coronets. Here is how it worked. British aristocracy in the late 1800s was in serious financial trouble. You see, for centuries these families had gotten their wealth from owning land. Huge estates in the countryside that tenant farmers worked. But with industrialization and agricultural changes, land was not producing the kind of income it used to. Meanwhile, these aristocratic families still had to maintain enormous country houses. We are talking about mansions with 50, 100, sometimes 200 rooms. They had to pay servants, maintain the buildings, keep up appearances. It was bankrupting them. But they had something the Americans wanted. They had titles, Duke, Earl, Marquis, Viscount, these ancient titles that came with centuries of history and prestige. So a deal was struck. American heiresses would bring enormous dowries. We are talking millions of dollars. And in exchange, they would get to be Duchess this or Countess that. They would get a title, a place in the British aristocracy, and instant social legitimacy that no amount of money could buy back home in America. Between 1875 and 1914, more than 60 of these marriages took place. 60 American heiresses married into British nobility, and the total amount of money that flowed from America to England during this time? Get ready for this number. It was over $220 million. Now, I know that might not sound like a staggering amount to modern ears, but let me put it in perspective. In 1900, $220 million had the purchasing power of roughly $6 billion today. $6 billion. That is nation-changing money. That is build an entire infrastructure money. And it was all spent buying titles for young women who, in many cases, had absolutely no say in the matter. Let me tell you about Consuelo Vanderbilt. Her story is so disturbing, so heartbreaking, that I almost did not want to include it because I was worried it would sound too extreme to be true. But I checked the sources. I read her autobiography. I verified every detail I'm about to share with you. And I can tell you with complete certainty, this happened. This is real. Consuelo was born in 1877 to one of the wealthiest families in America. Her full name was Consuelo Vanderbilt, and that last name meant everything in New York society. The Vanderbilts owned railroads, lots of railroads. They were so rich that when Consuelo's grandfather built a summer cottage in Rhode Island, he spent $11 million on it. $11 million in 1895. for a summer house. But Consuelo's mother, Alva Vanderbilt, wanted more than just money. She wanted social prestige, she wanted a title, and she decided that her daughter was going to get her one. Consuelo was 18 years old when her mother began negotiating her marriage to Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. And when I say negotiating, I mean it in the most cold-blooded business sense possible. This was not a romance. This was a merger. The Duke needed money. His family estate, Blenheim Palace, was falling apart. The roof was leaking. The walls needed repair. He was drowning in debt. But he had a title, one of the most prestigious in England. Alva wanted that title, and she was willing to pay for it. The problem? Consuelo was already in love with someone else. A young American man named Winthrop Rutherford. They wanted to get married. They had plans. They had a future together. Alva did not care. Here is what happened, according to Consuelo's own account written years later. When Consuelo tried to refuse the marriage to the Duke, when she told her mother that she loved someone else and wanted to marry him instead, Alva locked her in her room, just locked her in there, and would not let her out. Then Alva told her daughter that if she did not agree to marry the Duke, she, Alva, would kill herself. She would commit suicide, and it would be Consuelo's fault. Can you imagine your own mother, the person who's supposed to protect you and care for you and want your happiness above everything else, threatening to kill herself unless you agree to marry a man you've never even met? Consuelo was 18 years old. 18, still practically a child, and she was trapped in that room with her mother sobbing and threatening suicide, with her father, who honestly comes across as pretty weak in this whole story, not standing up to his wife, with servants and family members all telling her that she had to do her duty, had to think of the family, had to make this sacrifice. She broke. Of course she broke. What 18-year-old girl would not break under that kind of pressure? So on November the 6th, 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt married the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The settlement was enormous. $2.5 million in railroad stock paid immediately. Another $100,000 per year. That is roughly $3 million per year in today's money, for as long as the Duke lived. Plus Alva threw in another $3 million to help repair Blenheim Palace. The total? Somewhere between $10 and $15 million, depending on how you calculate the annual payments. And what did Consuelo get out of this deal? She got to be called Her Grace the Duchess of Marlborough. She got to live in one of the most famous houses in England. She got to wear a tiara. She also got a husband who, by all accounts, was cold, distant, and frequently cruel to her. They had 2 sons together. She did her duty there. But the marriage was miserable, absolutely miserable. They finally separated in 1906 and divorced in 1921, after Consuelo had spent 26 years trapped in a marriage she never wanted. 26 years. And you know what the really twisted part is? Alva, the mother who forced this marriage, who threatened suicide to make her daughter comply, who sold her own child to a British aristocrat, she later became a champion of women's rights. She gave money to the suffragette movement. She spoke about women's independence and freedom. The irony would be funny if it were not so tragic. But Consuelo's story is not unique, not even close. Let me give you another example. Another American heiress, another transactional marriage. May Goelet, born into another fabulously wealthy New York family. In 1895, the same year Consuelo married her duke, May married the 8th Duke of Roxburgh. The settlement in this case was estimated at around $20 million. $20 million. For context, that would be worth roughly $600 million today. May was 19 years old when she married. 19. and she spent the rest of her life as the Duchess of Roxburgh, living in Scotland, far from everyone and everything she'd known growing up. Was she happy? The historical records do not say much about her personal feelings, which tells you something right there, doesn't it? Her happiness was not important enough to record. Only the financial details mattered. Or consider Jenny Jerome, who married Lord Randolph Churchill and became the mother of Winston Churchill, or Mary Leiter, who became Lady Curzon and the Viceroy of India, or Virginia Boninge, who married the Earl of Deerhurst, or Helena Zimmerman, who married the Duke of Manchester. The list goes on and on. Dozens of young American women, most of them barely out of their teenage years, shipped across the Atlantic like merchandise, married off to men they did not know, all so their families could buy a place in European aristocracy. And here is the thing that really gets me. These girls, and I do mean girls because most of them were between 18 and 21 years old, they had no legal rights once they got married. None. Remember what we talked about earlier with the English marriage law? Once a woman married, her husband had complete control over her money, her property, her children, her entire life. So these American heiresses would arrive in England with their enormous dowries, marry their duke or earl or whoever, and then discover that they had just handed millions of dollars and complete control over their future to a man who saw them primarily as a source of income. A man who, in many cases, already had a mistress and saw his new wife as an inconvenient necessity. Some of these marriages worked out reasonably well. Some of the couples developed real affection for each other over time, but many, maybe even most, were disasters. The women were lonely, isolated in foreign countries, trapped in marriages to men who did not love them, unable to divorce because of the social stigma and legal difficulties. Their wealth could not save them. Their father's millions could not protect them. They had been traded like stocks on the marriage market, and once the deal was done, they had to live with the consequences for the rest of their lives. Do you know what I find most disturbing about this whole system? It is how organized it was, how open, how everyone just accepted it as normal. There were actually marriage brokers who specialized in matching American heiresses with titled Europeans. They would compile lists, they would negotiate terms, they would arrange meetings. It was like a real estate transaction, except the property being bought and sold was human beings. And everyone knew what was happening. The newspapers covered these weddings extensively. They published the financial details, how much money was changing hands, what the settlements included, what the annual allowances would be. It was all public information. No one was embarrassed by it. No one thought it was wrong. The only people who seemed to suffer were the girls themselves, and their suffering did not matter nearly as much as their dowries. I want you to think about something for a moment. Imagine being 18 years old. Imagine your mother locking you in your room and threatening to kill herself unless you marry someone you have never met. Imagine knowing that your entire future, your happiness, your freedom, maybe even your survival, is being negotiated like a business deal, and you have no say in any of it. Imagine getting on a ship to cross the Atlantic, leaving behind everything you have ever known, everyone you love, to marry a stranger in a foreign country. Imagine arriving at some enormous cold mansion in the English countryside and realizing, this is your life now, forever. You cannot leave, you cannot divorce, you cannot even complain too loudly, because that would be improper. Your wealth bought your husband a new roof for his house. And what did it buy you? A title that you never wanted, a marriage you never chose, a prison with very expensive furniture. That was the marriage market. That was what cash for coronets really meant. It meant young women being sold to the highest bidder, or rather to the highest ranking bidder, with no regard for what they wanted or how they felt or what kind of life they would have. The cynical businessmen of the Gilded Age knew how to make deals, and they made some of the most coldly calculating deals in history when they decided to trade their daughters' lives for aristocratic titles. But here is what they did not count on. They did not count on some of these women fighting back. They did not count on some of them finding ways to claim power in the system that was designed to keep them powerless. They did not count on divorce becoming more socially acceptable, or women beginning to demand rights, or the whole aristocratic system starting to crack at the foundations. Those stories are coming. We are going to meet some truly remarkable women who found ways to survive, and even thrive, in impossible circumstances. But we are not quite there yet. Next, we need to talk about what happened after the wedding. We need to talk about what life was actually like for these aristocratic women, both the ones who married for love and the ones who married for duty. We need to talk about the mistress system, about King Edward VII and his court, about the double standards that allowed men to do whatever they wanted while women were destroyed for the smallest indiscretion, because that is where the real darkness lives. That is where we find the stories that Victorian and Edwardian society desperately tried to hide. The affairs, the illegitimate children, the women whose reputations were ruined forever, while the men involved suffered no consequences at all. It is going to make you angry. I am warning you now, but it is a story that needs to be told. Stay with me. Picture a king who was so devoted to his mistresses that he had special chairs designed with hidden compartments, not for jewels or documents, but so he could hide gifts for his lovers when his wife walked into the room. Picture a society so accepting of male infidelity that newspapers actually published gossip about which aristocrat was sleeping with which actress, and everyone just laughed about it over breakfast. Picture a world where a woman could lose everything, her children, her reputation, her place in society, for a single indiscretion, while men collected mistresses like other people collected stamps. Welcome to the court of King Edward VII, and I am about to tell you some things that are going to make you question everything you thought you knew about the so-called good old days. Edward VII became King of England in 1901, when his mother, Queen Victoria, finally died after 63 years on the throne. But long before he was king, he was the Prince of Wales, and he spent nearly 60 years, waiting to inherit the throne. That is the longest anyone has ever been heir to the British crown. And during all that time, Edward did exactly one thing with remarkable consistency. He pursued pleasure, food, gambling, parties, and most of all women. Edward was famous, absolutely legendary for his appetite, and I mean that in every possible sense. The man ate enormous meals. We're talking about 9-course dinners followed by late-night snacks. He was a heavy smoker, cigars mostly, sometimes 20 or more per day. He loved horse racing and would bet thousands of pounds on a single race. But his real passion, the thing he was genuinely devoted to, was having affairs with other men's wives. Let me be very clear about something. Edward was not discreet. He was not subtle. He was not sneaking around hoping nobody would notice. Everyone knew. The whole country knew. The whole world knew. And nobody, absolutely nobody, seemed to think this was a problem. His wife Alexandra knew. She had to know. How could she not? Edward's mistresses were paraded in front of her at social events. They sat at her dinner tier. They accompanied the royal couple on trips. Alexandra just had to smile and pretend she did not notice that her husband was sleeping with half the women in her social circle. And here is the thing that makes this even more twisted. Alexandra was, by all accounts, lovely. Genuinely lovely. Kind, gracious, beautiful, even after bearing 6 children. She set fashion trends. She was beloved by the British public. She never caused a scandal, never put a foot wrong, never did anything that could be considered improper. And her husband cheated on her constantly, openly, without shame for their entire marriage. let me tell you about some of Edward's most famous mistresses, because their stories reveal so much about the world we are exploring. First, there was Lily Langtry. Lily was an actress, which was already somewhat scandalous because actresses in the late 1800s were seen as not quite respectable. She was also married, which apparently did not matter to Edward at all. Their affair lasted for years, and it was so public that when Edward attended the theatre, people would watch to see if Lily was performing, because they knew he would be there if she was. Lily became famous not for her acting talent, though she was apparently quite good, but for being the king's mistress. Well, the future king at that point. She had her portrait painted by famous artists. She was invited to high society events. She became a celebrity in her own right, all because she was sleeping with the heir to the throne. Now here is the question I want you to think about. What do you think happened to Lily's husband during all this? Do you think he divorced her? Do you think he caused a scandal? Do you think he did anything at all to stop his wife from having a very public affair with the Prince of Wales? Number. He did nothing. Because honestly, what could he do? The man she was having an affair with was going to be the King of England. You do not challenge the future king. You just quietly accept it and hope that some of the royal favour rubs off on you too. And that tells you everything about the power dynamics we are dealing with here. The rules that applied to everyone else simply did not apply to Edward. He could do whatever he wanted. And the women who became his mistresses, they were elevated, celebrated, made famous, given access to parties and events that would have been closed to them otherwise. But if a wife had an affair, if a woman from high society was caught being unfaithful to her husband, she was destroyed, utterly destroyed. We will talk more about that in a moment. Edward's most significant mistress, the one who lasted the longest, the one who genuinely seemed to matter to him, was a woman named Alice Keppel. And if that last name sounds familiar to you, there is a reason for that. Alice Keppel was the great-great-grandmother of Camilla Parker Bowles, who became the Duchess of Cornwall and is now Queen Consort after marrying King Charles III. Yes, that Camilla. So there is this fascinating historical echo, isn't there? Edward VII had a long-term relationship with Alice Keppel while being married to Alexandra, and more than a century later, Edward's great-great-grandson Charles had a long-term relationship with Alice's great-great-granddaughter Camilla while being married to Diana. History does not repeat itself, they say, but apparently it rhymes. Alice Keppel was married when she met Edward. She had children. She had a husband, George Keppel, an army officer who was, by all accounts, completely fine with his wife being the king's mistress. In fact, he seems to have benefited from it. The royal favour meant promotions, social connections, financial advantages. So George just looked the other way while his wife conducted a very public affair with the King of England. Alice was clever, much cleverer than most of Edward's other mistresses. She understood that her power came from being discreet enough not to cause actual public scandal while being visible enough that everyone knew about her position. She became one of the most influential women in England, not because of anything she accomplished herself, but because she was sleeping with the king. People wanted invitations to parties she attended. They wanted to be in her social circle. They asked her for favours, knowing she had the king's ear. She wielded enormous informal power, power that no woman could have gained through any legitimate means because women had no legal or political power at all. So she used the only currency available to her: her body, her beauty, her ability to keep a powerful man entertained. And here is the part that I find simultaneously fascinating and deeply depressing. Society not only accepted this, they celebrated it. There was actually a term for these women, the professional beauties. They were the it girls of their day, the influencers, if you want a modern comparison. Women whose primary accomplishment was being beautiful and charming and available to wealthy, powerful men. Some of them were actresses, like Lily Langtry. Some were from aristocratic families themselves, women who married well but had affairs better. Some were from the margins of respectability, women who used their looks and charm to climb into social circles that would normally be closed to them, and they were famous, genuinely famous. Their photographs were sold in shops. People collected postcards of them. They set fashion trends. When they wore a particular style of hat or dress, suddenly everyone wanted that style. They were written about in newspapers and magazines. They were invited to the best parties, the most exclusive events, all because they were beautiful and willing to be mistresses to the powerful men. Now, I want to pause for a moment and talk about the double standard we are dealing with here, because it is so extreme, so blatant, that it almost defies belief. If you were a man, particularly if you were an aristocratic man, and especially if you were a wealthy, powerful aristocratic man, you could have as many affairs as you wanted. You could keep a mistress. You could keep multiple mistresses. You could father illegitimate children all over England. And as long as you were reasonably discreet, meaning you did not literally parade your mistresses through church on Sunday morning or anything that obvious, society would shrug and look the other way. Boys will be boys, they would say. It is just how men are. But if you were a woman, if you were a wife who had an affair, you were ruined. Completely, utterly, irreversibly ruined. Your husband could divorce you, and remember, divorce was still extremely difficult and scandalous, but the laws were written to make it much easier for men than for women. He could take your children away from you, and you would have no legal recourse, none. He could throw you out of the house with nothing. You would be cut off from society. Your friends would drop you. Your family might disown you. You would never be invited to another respectable party for the rest of your life. And here is the kicker. Your husband could have been the one who drove you to the affair. He could have been cruel, abusive, unfaithful himself. None of that mattered. If you were caught having an affair, you paid the full price. Let me give you a specific example of how this played out. There was a woman named Lady Colin Campbell, no relation to the modern Campbell family as far as I know, who was married to a younger son of a duke. Her husband was, by all accounts, a terrible person. He was abusive. He gave her venereal disease, which was apparently something he picked up from his own affairs. He was cruel to her in ways that are genuinely difficult to read about even now. Lady Colin tried to divorce him. She had grounds. He had committed adultery. He was abusive. He had given her a disease. But when the case went to court in 1886, it turned into a circus. Her husband countersued, claiming she had been unfaithful to him. The trial lasted weeks. Every intimate detail of their marriage was discussed in public. Newspapers printed transcripts. The entire country was reading about Lady Colin's sex life over their morning tea. In the end, neither divorce was granted. The judge decided there was not enough evidence on either side, so Lady Colin remained legally married to a man who had abused her and given her venereal disease, and her reputation was destroyed forever. She was never received in polite society again. Her husband? He was fine. A bit embarrassed maybe, but he still had his place in society. He could still attend parties. He was still part of the aristocratic world. She was erased. That is the world these women lived in. A world where a king could have mistresses that everyone knew about and nobody cared. A world where husbands could cheat openly and freely, but where a woman who stepped out of line, even if she had very good reasons, would lose everything. And the most twisted part? Many of the mistresses, the women who became famous for being beautiful and available to powerful men, they knew this. They understood the game. They knew that their power was temporary, that it depended entirely on a man's continued favour. They knew that the moment he got bored or died or decided to move on, they would have nothing. So some of them tried to secure their futures. They would negotiate for gifts, houses, jewelry, money. They would try to get financial settlements, insurance policies for when the affair eventually ended. Because it always ended. The man would get older, or find someone younger, or die. And then where would his mistress be? If she was lucky, she'd been smart enough to save money and buy property and set herself up with some financial security. If she was not lucky, she would end up dependent on other men, moving from affair to affair, desperately trying to maintain her position as she got older and less desirable. It was a brutal system, absolutely brutal. And yet, for some women, it was the only path to any kind of power or influence. Because remember, women could not vote. They could not own property once they married. They could not pursue most professions. They had almost no legal rights. The courts, the laws, the entire system was designed by men and for men. So some women looked at this system and decided, if the only currency I have is my body and my beauty, then I am going to use it as strategically as possible. I am going to trade it for money, for security, for access to power, for whatever advantage I can squeeze out of this completely unfair game. Can you blame them? Can you honestly say that if you were in their position, trapped in a society that gave you no other options, you would not do the same thing? But here is what really gets me. Here is the part that makes me so angry I can barely keep my voice steady. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. It kept women divided. It kept them competing with each other for male attention and male favour instead of banding together to challenge the system itself. The wives hated the mistresses. The mistresses looked down on the wives as boring and undesirable. The women who tried to be proper and follow all the rules looked down on the women who broke them. And all of them, were being controlled and used by men who set the rules and changed them whenever it suited them. Edward VII died in 1910. He was 68 years old. He had been king for only 9 years, but he had been a public figure for his entire adult life. When he died, Alice Keppel was at his deathbed. His wife Alexandra actually allowed her to be there. Can you imagine? Can you imagine being so thoroughly beaten down by this system that you allow your husband's mistress to be present when he dies? But Alexandra did, because that is what society expected. That is what the rules said was proper. The wife maintains dignity. The wife never makes a scene. The wife accepts that her husband will have other women, and she just has to bear it gracefully. Alice Keppel lived for another 37 years after Edward died. She moved to Italy eventually. She had her memories and, presumably, whatever financial arrangement she'd managed to secure during her years as the king's mistress. She died in 1947, having outlived both her royal lover and the era they represented. And her great-great-granddaughter Camilla? Well, she married the heir to the throne. So I suppose in some strange way history really does rhyme. But we are not done with this era yet. We are not done examining the ways that wealth and privilege failed to protect women from the cruelty of the system they lived in. Because everything we have talked about so far, the corsets, the marriage market, the mistress system, these were all the public faces of oppression. The things that society was comfortable acknowledging, even if it was wrapped in euphemism and polite language. Next, we need to talk about what happened behind closed doors. We need to talk about domestic violence in aristocratic families, about the women who had no escape from abusive husbands, about the ways that money and social status actually made it harder to get help, not easier. We need to talk about the secret sufferings that nobody was allowed to mention. And I am warning you now, this part of the story is dark, cruelly dark. But these women deserve to have their stories told. They deserve to be remembered as more than just beautiful faces in old photographs. So stay with me. We are going deeper into the darkness. But I promise, there is a reason we need to go there. These stories matter. Imagine waking up every morning in a mansion with 50 rooms, surrounded by servants, wearing clothes worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Now imagine that same morning, knowing that the man you are legally bound to for the rest of your life has complete ownership of your body, your money, your children, and your future. Imagine knowing that if he hurts you, nobody will help. And if you try to leave, you will lose everything, including your babies. Imagine living in a golden cage where the bars are made of marriage vows and social expectations, and the lock is a legal system designed to keep you trapped forever. This is the part of the story that Victorian and Edwardian society desperately tried to hide. This is the darkness that lurked behind the silk curtains and the polite dinner conversations. This is what happened when wealth and privilege collided with a legal system that treated women as property. Let me start with a statistic that should shock you. In 1860, a Member of Parliament named John Walter stood up in the House of Commons and said something that caused quite a stir. He said, and I am paraphrasing here, but this is the essence of his statement, that if people actually knew what went on inside aristocratic homes, if the secrets of wealthy households were revealed, they would discover that brutal assaults on women were not confined to the lower classes at all. They happened everywhere, in the finest homes, in families with the oldest titles and the most respected names. But nobody wanted to believe that. It was much more comfortable to think that domestic violence was a problem of the poor, of the uneducated, of people who did not know any better. Surely wealthy, educated, refined gentlemen would never beat their wives. Surely aristocratic women were safe in their grand houses with their armies of servants. Except they were not safe at all. Here is how the law worked in England during this period, and honestly, the more I learn about it, the more disgusted I become. A married woman had essentially no legal identity separate from her husband. This was called coverture, the idea that a woman's legal existence was covered by her husband's, which is a fancy way of saying she did not exist in the eyes of the law. Her property became his property the moment they married. Her money became his money. Any income she earned, and remember, most aristocratic women did not work, but if they had inherited wealth or received an allowance from their families, all of that, it all belonged to her husband. He could spend it however he wanted. He could gamble it away. He could give it to his mistresses. She had no say. And here is the really horrifying part. He had complete legal authority over her body. That is not an exaggeration or a euphemism. Legally, he owned her. He could force her to have sex whenever he wanted. The concept of marital rape did not exist in law. He could physically restrain her, could prevent her from leaving the house, could control who she saw and where she went. And none of that was illegal. None of it was even considered improper, as long as he did not cause scandal. The only time the law would potentially intervene was if the violence became so extreme, so public, that it could not be ignored. And even then, the concern was not really about the woman's safety. The concern was about maintaining social order and preventing scandal. Let me tell you about the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, because understanding this law is crucial to understanding how trapped these women were. This was actually considered progressive legislation, reformist, a huge step forward for women's rights. Before 1857, divorce in England was nearly impossible. You literally had to get a private Act of Parliament passed. It was so expensive and complicated that only the wealthiest people could even attempt it. And it was extraordinarily rare. Maybe 3 or 4 divorces per year in the entire country. The Matrimonial Causes Act was supposed to make divorce more accessible, and it did technically. It created a divorce court, it established grounds for divorce. It was supposed to help women escape bad marriages, but here is the catch, and it is a huge catch. The law was designed with a massive double standard built right into it. If a man wanted to divorce his wife, he only had to prove one thing, that she had committed adultery. That was it. One affair, and he could divorce her, keep the children, keep all the property, and walk away. But if a woman wanted to divorce her husband, she had to prove adultery plus something else, adultery plus incest, or adultery plus bigamy, or adultery plus cruelty, or adultery plus desertion for at least 2 years. Just adultery alone was not enough. Her husband could sleep with every woman in London, could father a dozen illegitimate children, could bring his mistresses into the family home, and none of that was sufficient grounds for her to divorce him. She had to prove that he was not just unfaithful, but also either committing incest, or married to someone else, or beating her, or had abandoned her for years. And even then, even if she could prove all of that, there was one more twisted clause in the law. If the wife had permitted the incest or desired the cruelty, or if she had forgiven the adultery at any point and then later tried to use it as grounds for divorce, the court could rule against her. Think about that for a moment. The law literally assumed that a woman might want to be treated cruelly, that she might permit incest, whatever that means, and honestly, I do not want to think too hard about what scenarios that was meant to cover. The law was written to make it as difficult as possible for women to escape marriages, even horrific ones, while making it relatively easy for men to discard wives who did not please them. So what did this mean in practice? It meant that aristocratic women who were being abused by their husbands had essentially no real recourse, no way out, no legal protection. They could not go to the police. The police would not get involved in domestic matters between a husband and wife. They could not go to the courts unless they could prove that their husband was both unfaithful and either incestuous, bigamous, or violent to an extreme degree. And even if they could prove all that, going to court meant making everything public. It meant a trial where every detail of their marriage would be discussed in newspapers. It meant destroying their own reputation even while trying to escape. So most women just suffered in silence. Let me tell you about Françoise de Choiseul-Praslin, because her story is one of the few that actually became public, and it is absolutely heartbreaking. Françoise was a French duchess, married to Duke Charles de Choiseul-Praslin. They had 9 children together. 9. She had devoted her entire adult life to being his wife and the mother of his children. But the Duke had fallen in love with their children's governess. He wanted to be with this other woman, and Françoise was in the way. On August the 17th, 1847, Françoise was found in the family's Paris apartment, covered in stab wounds and having been beaten severely. She died a few hours later. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly to her husband. Blood on his clothes. The murder weapon in his room. No signs of forced entry, nobody else could have done it. The Duke was arrested. He was going to go to trial. And here is where the story takes an even darker turn. Before the trial could begin, the Duke committed suicide in his cell by taking arsenic. He left notes protesting his innocence. But come on, he killed himself before he could be tried. That tells you everything. And you know what the real tragedy is? The scandal from this case, not the murder itself, not the fact that a duke had murdered his wife, but the scandal, the public attention, the damage to the reputation of the French aristocracy. That scandal was one of the contributing factors to the Revolution of 1848. The French people were so disgusted by the corruption and violence of the aristocracy that it helped trigger a revolution. But Françoise was still dead. Her 9 children were orphans, and the man who killed her never faced justice. Now, Françoise's case became public because the violence was so extreme that it could not be hidden. But what about all the cases that never made it into the newspapers? What about the thousands of women who were being hurt in ways that left no physical scars, or whose injuries could be explained away, or who were too terrified to speak up? There was a term that doctors used during this period. and I need you to understand how insidious this term was. They called it hysteria. If a woman complained too much, if she seemed emotionally unstable, if she could not explain her symptoms in a way that made sense to male doctors, she was diagnosed with hysteria. And the treatment for hysteria? It varied. Sometimes they would prescribe bed rest, which sounds harmless until you realize that bed rest often meant being confined to a room, not allowed to see anyone, not allowed to do anything for weeks or months at a time. Sometimes they would prescribe travel, sending the woman away from her home, which also conveniently removed her from any potential support system she might have had. In extreme cases, they would institutionalize women. They would send them to asylums for the insane. And here is the truly horrifying part. A husband could have his wife committed without much difficulty. He just needed to convince a doctor that she was suffering from hysteria or some other form of female nervous disorder. The woman herself had no say in the matter. She could be perfectly sane, perfectly rational, and still find herself locked up in an asylum because her husband wanted to get rid of her. There are documented cases of women being institutionalized for years, because they made their husbands angry or inconvenient. Some of these women were having affairs, yes, but some of them were just rebellious, or depressed, or angry at being trapped in marriages they hated. And their husbands used the medical system to punish them, to silence them, to make them disappear. Can you imagine living with that threat hanging over your head? Can you imagine knowing that if you complained too loudly about your husband's behavior, if you pushed back too hard against his control, he could have you declared insane and locked away? That he could take your children and tell them you'd lost your mind, that you might never see your family or friends again? That is psychological torture. That is living in constant fear, and it was completely legal. Now, I want to talk about something that might seem unrelated at first, but trust me, it all connects. There was an organization founded in 1843 called the Associate Institute for Improving and Enforcing the Laws for the Protection of Women and Children. Long name, I know, but the work they did was important. They hired inspectors who investigated cases of abuse and brought prosecutions against the worst offenders. But here is the thing, and this is so telling, they focused almost exclusively on working-class women. They investigated factories and slums and poor neighborhoods. The organization's charter explicitly stated that they were helping women and children from the lower classes. Why? Because Victorian society operated on the assumption that middle-class and aristocratic families did not need this kind of intervention. The assumption was that wealthy, educated men would not abuse their families, that proper households, ones with money and social standing, did not have these problems. It was a complete fiction. But it was a fiction that everyone agreed to maintain, because acknowledging the truth that violence and abuse happened at every level of society, in the finest homes and the most respectable families, would have been too threatening to the social order. So aristocratic women who were being abused had nowhere to turn. The police would not help them. The courts would not help them unless they met impossible standards of proof. The medical establishment might declare them hysterical and lock them up. Their families might tell them to endure it for the sake of appearances. Society would blame them for not being good enough wives. They were completely, utterly trapped. And here is something that I think is important to understand. The wealth actually made it worse in some ways. Because when you are rich, when you have status, when everyone thinks your life is perfect, speaking up about abuse becomes even harder. Who is going to believe you? You have everything. You live in a mansion. You wear beautiful clothes. You go to parties. What could you possibly have to complain about? The gilded cage is still a cage. And sometimes the gold makes the bars stronger, not weaker. Let me tell you about one more woman, and I am choosing this case carefully because it illustrates something important. There was a woman, and I am not going to use her real name because her family tried very hard to keep this quiet, who was married to a wealthy landowner. He was well respected, member of a good club, never caused any public scandal, but in private, he was a monster. He beat her. He controlled every aspect of her life. He told her what to wear, what to say, who she could see. And when she was pregnant with their third child, he beat her so badly that she miscarried. She tried to leave. She went to her father and begged him to help her. And you know what her father said? He told her that she had made her vows before God, that marriage was sacred, that she needed to be more patient, more understanding, a better wife. He sent her back. She tried again a year later. This time she went to a doctor, showed him her bruises, asked him to help her get away. The doctor examined her, confirmed that she'd been injured, and then told her husband everything she had said. Because the doctor's primary responsibility was to the man, not the woman. The husband was his patient. The husband paid his bills. After that, her husband became more careful. He learned to hit her in places that would not show. He learned to use psychological torture instead of physical violence. He would lock her in her room for days at a time. He would tell their children that their mother was sick, was unstable, could not be trusted. She lived like that for 17 years. 17 years. Until her husband finally died of a heart attack, and she was free. But was she free? She was in her early 40s by then. Her children were grown and they had been taught to see her as weak, as hysterical, as someone who needed to be managed and controlled. Her health was destroyed from years of stress and abuse. Her spirit was broken. The wealth could not save her. The fine house and the servants and the social status, none of it mattered. She was trapped just as surely as any woman in a tenement, except that her cage was more beautiful and people refused to see the bars. That is what we need to understand about this era. The beauty, the luxury, the glamour that we see in old photographs and costume dramas, all of that coexisted with systematic, brutal oppression of women. The same society that produced gorgeous dresses and glittering balls also produced laws that treated women as property. The same men who threw lavish parties and patronized the arts also had complete legal authority to abuse their wives with impunity. And the women? They learned to survive. Some of them found ways to carve out small spaces of autonomy within the constraints they faced. Some of them developed friendships with other women that provided emotional support even when they could not offer practical help. Some of them just endured, day after day, year after year, until either they or their husbands died and the nightmare ended. But some women fought back. Not all of them stayed silent. Not all of them accepted their fate. And in the next part of our story, we're going to talk about what happened when women's desperation met opportunity. We're going to talk about poison, why it became known as the woman's weapon, why so many Victorian and Edwardian murder trials involved wives accused of poisoning their husbands, and what that tells us about just how trapped these women felt. Because when society gives you no legal way out, when divorce is impossible and the police will not help and your own family tells you to endure, some women decided that murder was their only option. And the stories of these women, some of them guilty, some of them innocent, all of them desperate, reveal just how dark things could get behind those beautiful facades. Stay with me. We're going into the darkest part of this story, but we need to go there. We need to understand just how desperate these women were, just how completely the system had failed them. Only then can we understand why World War I changed everything. There is something darkly fascinating about the fact that in Victorian and Edwardian England, you could walk into any pharmacy and buy arsenic with almost no questions asked. You just had to sign a register. That was it, a signature. And you could walk out with enough poison to kill your entire household. Now, the official reason for buying arsenic was usually pest control. It was excellent for killing rats. But here's what nobody wanted to say out loud. An awful lot of husbands were dying from the same substance that was supposed to be killing rodents. And when investigators started looking closely at these deaths, they discovered something that shocked Victorian society to its core. The person most likely to poison you was not a stranger, not a burglar, not some criminal from the streets, it was your wife. Welcome to what the Victorians called the domestic poison panic, and I need to tell you, this story is going to make you think very differently about those seemingly peaceful Victorian households. Let me start with a trial that captured the imagination of all of England in 1872. The defendant was a woman named Christiana Edmonds, and her case is so bizarre, so twisted, that if I told you it was from a television show, you would probably think the writers had gone too far. But this really happened. Christiana was 43 years old, unmarried, living in Brighton, a fashionable seaside town. She had fallen in love with her doctor, a married man named Charles Beard. She wanted him. She wanted him desperately, but there was a problem. Well, several problems. He was married. He was not particularly interested in her, and his wife was very much alive and in the way. So Christiana came up with a plan. She would poison the wife, but she was clever enough to know that if Dr. Beard's wife suddenly died of poison, suspicion would fall on anyone who had a motive. So she decided to create a cover story. She would make it look like there was a mad poisoner on the loose in Brighton, someone poisoning people at random, and then, in the middle of all that chaos, she would poison the doctor's wife and it would just look like she was another victim of this random killer. Are you following the logic here? She was going to murder multiple innocent people just to disguise the murder of one specific person. So Christiana started buying chocolates from various shops around Brighton. She would inject them with strychnine, a poison that causes one of the most horrible deaths imaginable, by the way. Muscle spasms so violent they can break your bones, inability to breathe, complete awareness of what is happening to you until the very end. Then she would return the poisoned chocolates to the shops, claiming they tasted odd or that she had bought too many and wanted to return them. The shops would put them back on the shelves, and innocent people would buy them and die. A 4-year-old boy named Sidney Barker was one of her victims. 4 years old. He bought a bag of chocolate creams and ate them on his way home. He died in agony. Several other people became violently ill from eating poisoned chocolates. The town was in a panic. People stopped buying sweets. Shops were losing business. The police were desperately trying to find this mysterious poisoner. And here is the most chilling part. When Christiana finally went to trial, because she was eventually caught, thank goodness, the courtroom was packed with well-dressed women. The newspapers described them as enthralled by the case. They came back day after day, session after session, until the courtroom gallery was filled with fashionable ladies watching this trial of a woman who had murdered a child and poisoned strangers, all for love of a man who did not want her. The newspapers speculated that these women were coming to learn, to see how Christiana had done it, to understand her methods, as if this was some kind of educational seminar instead of a murder trial. That tells you something terrifying about the time period, does it not? The fact that respectable women would flock to watch a poisoning trial, that they would sit there taking mental notes about methods and motives and mistakes. What does that say about how many women were thinking about poison as a solution to their own problems? Now, Christiana was eventually found guilty but insane. She spent the rest of her life in Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, which sounds like something from a Gothic novel but was very real. She died there in 1907, having spent 35 years locked up. But her case opened up a conversation that Victorian society really did not want to have, because once people started paying attention, once investigators started looking at deaths that had previously been attributed to natural causes or accidents, they discovered something disturbing. A lot of husbands were dying. A lot. And the common factor in many of these deaths was a wife who had recently purchased arsenic for pest control. Let me give you some statistics that are genuinely shocking. Between 1850 and 1890, there were hundreds of trials in England for murder by poisoning. The vast majority of defendants were women, and the vast majority of victims were husbands. Now, does that mean all of these women were guilty? Absolutely not. In fact, one of the most tragic aspects of the poison panic was that innocent women were sometimes convicted based on circumstantial evidence and social prejudice. But it does mean that poisoning had become associated in the public mind with women, and specifically with wives who wanted to escape their marriages. There is a phrase that historians use, the feminization of poisoning. What that means is that during the Victorian and Edwardian eras, poison went from being seen as a crime anyone might commit to being seen as specifically a woman's crime, a domestic crime, something that happened in the home, in the kitchen, in the private spaces where women had access and control. And here is why that happened. Remember everything we have talked about in the previous parts of this story. Women had no legal way to escape bad marriages. Divorce was nearly impossible. The police would not help with domestic abuse. Society told them to endure. Their families told them to stay. The courts were designed to keep them trapped. So some women looked at their options. And I want to be very clear here. I am not saying this was right or justified. I am just explaining the logic, and they decided that the only way out was murder. But women could not exactly challenge their husbands to duels. They could not overpower most men physically. They could not shoot them without the noise alerting servants or neighbours. They needed a method that was quiet, that looked like natural death, that could be done in the home without arousing immediate suspicion. Poison was the answer. It was accessible. You could buy it legally. It was quiet. No gunshots, no screams. It could mimic natural illness, especially in a time before modern forensic medicine. And it was something women had legitimate reasons to have in the house. Arsenic was used not just for killing rats, but also in some medicines and even in some cosmetics. A woman with arsenic in her possession was not automatically suspicious, so poison became known as the woman's weapon. And once that association was made, any woman whose husband died under even slightly suspicious circumstances might find herself on trial for her life. Let me tell you about Adelaide Bartlett, because her case perfectly illustrates how complicated and dark these situations could become. In 1886, Adelaide was accused of murdering her husband Edwin by poisoning him with chloroform. Now, the facts of this case are absolutely wild, and I'm not going to go into all the bizarre details about their marriage, which was genuinely strange even by Victorian standards. But here is what matters for our story. Edwin died with a massive amount of chloroform in his stomach, not in his lungs, which is what you would expect if he had inhaled it or if it had been forced on him, in his stomach, meaning he swallowed it. The question was, did he swallow it voluntarily as a suicide, or did Adelaide somehow get him to drink it? The prosecution argued that Adelaide had murdered him. They pointed out that she had a motive. She was in love with another man, a minister who'd become very close to the family. They pointed out that she had obtained chloroform shortly before her husband's death. They built what seemed like a solid case. But Adelaide was acquitted. The jury could not figure out how she could have gotten her husband to swallow that much chloroform without him knowing it was poison. Chloroform tastes terrible, burns the throat. Edwin would have had to drink it voluntarily, or Adelaide would have had to force it down his throat, which would have left marks and evidence of a struggle. There was no such evidence, so Adelaide walked free. But here is the thing. After the trial, she disappeared. She left England and was never heard from again. To this day, nobody knows what really happened. Did she kill him? Did he kill himself? Was it some kind of accident that nobody could explain? The case became famous not because it was solved, but because it was not. and it fed into the public paranoia about poisoning wives. Even when women were acquitted, even when there was reasonable doubt, society still looked at them with suspicion. Now I want to talk about a case where we are pretty certain the woman was innocent, because this story is absolutely heartbreaking, and it shows you how dangerous it was to be a woman accused of poisoning your husband. Her name was Anne Merritt. In 1850, she was accused of murdering her husband James with arsenic. The evidence against her was mostly circumstantial. She had purchased arsenic. Her husband had died with symptoms that could have been arsenic poisoning, but also could have been from several natural diseases. There was no solid proof that she'd given him the poison, but Anne had something working against her. Her husband had been a drunk, an abusive drunk. Everyone knew he beat her. Everyone knew she was miserable in the marriage, and that gave her a motive. The trial was quick. The jury was not sympathetic. Anne was convicted and sentenced to death. Here is the part that kills me. In her final statement before the magistrate, Anne said that she had bought the arsenic for herself. She said she had been planning to commit suicide because she could not take her husband's abuse anymore. She said she could not go through with it, and she thought maybe her husband had taken the arsenic himself, either accidentally, thinking it was one of his stomach remedies, or deliberately as his own suicide. Was she telling the truth? We will never know, but what we do know is this. Anne Merritt was hanged, she was executed, and right up until the moment they put the noose around her neck, she maintained that she was innocent. How many other women were executed or imprisoned for murders they did not commit? How many women were convicted because juries believed that an unhappy wife must be a murderous wife? And here is the flip side of that question. How many women did commit murder? And were they really the villains? Or were they desperate women who saw no other way out of situations that were slowly killing them anyway? I want to read you something from a Victorian medical journal. This is from 1856, written by a doctor who was observing the poison panic. He wrote, and I am modernizing the language slightly so it is easier to follow. He wrote that women were turning to poison because they had no other weapons. They could not fight men with fists or guns. They could not escape through legal means. So they fought with the only weapon available to them, subterfuge and poison. He was not condoning it, but he was acknowledging the reality. When you trap people with no way out, some of them will fight back using whatever tools they have. Now, not every poisoning case involved an abused wife trying to escape. Christiana Edmonds was not escaping abuse. She was trying to eliminate a rival for a man's affection. There were cases of women poisoning for inheritance money. There were cases of women poisoning because of jealousy or revenge or pure malice. Women are not inherently better or more moral than men. They are just people. And people, when pushed to extremes, are capable of terrible things regardless of gender. But what is striking about the Victorian poison panic is how it revealed the desperation of women's situations. The fact that so many women were willing to risk execution, and execution by hanging was the penalty for murder, tells you just how unbearable their lives must have been. When death by hanging seems preferable to continuing in your marriage, when you are willing to risk everything on a desperate gamble to escape, that tells you something profound about the system you're living in. And here is something else that is important to understand. The poison trials became public entertainment. Newspapers covered them extensively. People followed the cases like we follow celebrity trials today, and the coverage was sensationalized, dramatic, designed to shock and titillate. But what the newspapers often left out was context. They did not talk about the abuse the woman might have suffered. They did not explore the legal system that made escape impossible. They did not ask why so many women were desperate enough to turn to murder. Instead, they created this image of the female poisoner as a particular type of villain: seductive, manipulative, cold-blooded, They made it seem like women were poisoning their husbands for trivial reasons, because they were bored or wanted a new hat, or had met someone more interesting. It made for good newspaper sales. It did not make for good truth-telling. There was one woman, I'm not going to name her because her descendants are still around and this is still sensitive, but there was one woman who was tried for poisoning her husband in the 1870s. During the trial, it came out that her husband had given her venereal disease. He had contracted it from prostitutes and passed it to her. This was before antibiotics, so venereal disease could be a slow, painful death sentence. The woman testified that after she discovered she'd been infected, she contemplated suicide every single day. She said she thought about poison constantly, but for herself, not for him. She said the arsenic in her house was meant for her, not for him. She wanted to end her own suffering, not his life. The jury did not believe her. They thought she was lying. They convicted her of murder. But what if she was telling the truth? What if she really had been planning to take her own life? And what if her husband really had taken the poison accidentally, or even deliberately? What if this woman was executed for a crime she did not commit, while the real tragedy was that she had been driven to the edge of suicide by a disease her husband had given her? These are the questions that haunt me about this era. These are the stories that keep me up at night, because in so many of these cases, we will never know the real truth. We only know what the court decided, and the courts were run by men, judged by men based on laws written by men. So when a woman stood accused of poisoning her husband, she was not just facing a murder trial. She was facing a system that had already decided women were property, that abuse was a private matter, that wives had no right to escape marriages no matter how terrible they were. Is it any wonder that some women looked at poison and saw it as their only option? I am not saying murder is ever justified. I want to be absolutely clear about that. Taking another person's life is wrong, period. But I am saying that we need to understand the context. We need to understand the desperation. We need to understand that these women were not monsters. They were human beings pushed to the absolute limit of what they could endure. And we need to understand that the real crime, the real systematic, ongoing, institutionalized crime, was the way society treated women in the first place. But poison was not the only response to impossible situations. Some women found other ways to fight back. Some of them survived and even found ways to claim small victories within the system that oppressed them. And in our next part, we are going to talk about the women who looked at the new century dawning and thought maybe, just maybe, things can change. We are going to talk about the new woman, the educated, ambitious women who were starting to push back against centuries of restriction. We are going to talk about what happened when intelligence and education collided with a society that still wanted women to be decorative and silent, because that collision created some of the most fascinating and frustrating stories of the era. Women who had university degrees but could not practice their professions. Women who wrote brilliant books under male pseudonyms. Women who had to choose between marriage and career because society refused to let them have both. The cage was still there, but some women were starting to rattle the bars, and the sound was making a lot of people very, very nervous. Imagine spending years studying medicine, passing every examination with top marks, proving yourself more capable than most of your male classmates, finally earning your degree from a prestigious university, and then being told you cannot actually practice medicine because you are a woman. Imagine writing a brilliant legal brief, understanding the law better than most lawyers in the country, having judges privately admit that your work is exceptional, and then being told you cannot represent clients in court because women are not allowed to be barristers. Imagine being the smartest person in the room, having ideas that could change the world, possessing skills that took decades to develop, and having all of it dismissed because you had the misfortune of being born female. This is the story of the new woman. And let me tell you, being intelligent in the early 1900s was almost as dangerous as being trapped in a bad marriage. The term new woman appeared in the 1890s, and it described something that made traditional society deeply uncomfortable. These were women who wanted education, who wanted careers, who questioned whether marriage and motherhood should be the only options available to them, who looked at the world and said, "Why can I not participate in this? Why am I limited to the drawing room when I could be in the laboratory, the courtroom, the university lecture hall?" And society's answer was, "Because you're a woman, and that should be reason enough." But the new women were not accepting that answer anymore, and the battles they fought, the ones they won and the ones they lost, tell us so much about just how threatened the establishment felt by the idea of educated, ambitious women. Let me start with something that is going to make you angry. In 1909, German universities finally allowed women to enroll as students. 1909. We are talking about less than a decade before the end of World War I. Germany was one of the most advanced nations in the world. They were leaders in science, philosophy, industry, music, and they did not allow women into universities until 1909. But wait, it gets better, or worse, depending on how you look at it. Even after women were allowed to attend university and earn degrees, they were barred from actually practicing their professions, so you could spend years studying law, pass all your examinations, earn your degree, and then be told that women could not practice law. You could not represent clients, you could not argue cases in court. Your degree was essentially decorative. They let women get educated, but then prevented them from using that education. Let that sink in for a moment. What kind of cruel joke is that? It is like teaching someone to swim and then never letting them near water. There is a woman I need to tell you about. Her name was Anita Augsburg, and she was the first woman in Germany to graduate with a law degree. But she did not graduate from a German university. She could not, because they would not admit her. Instead, she went to the University of Zurich in Switzerland, which had been admitting women since 1867. She earned her degree there in 1897. Then she came back to Germany and tried to practice law, and she was told no. Women cannot be lawyers. It does not matter that you have a degree. It does not matter that you passed all the examinations. It does not matter that you are clearly qualified. You are a woman, therefore you cannot practice law. So Anita did what any reasonable person would do when faced with complete institutional injustice. She became a radical feminist activist. She fought for women's suffrage. She fought for women's rights to education and employment. She fought for the right of women to control their own bodies and their own futures. And you know what the establishment called her? Hysterical, unfeminine, dangerous, a threat to social order. Of course they did. Because women demanding equal rights has always been framed as hysteria by people who benefit from inequality. Now let me tell you about what was happening in France. Because France has this reputation as being sophisticated and progressive, but let me tell you, they were just as bad when it came to women's education and employment. There was a woman named Maria Véron who became the first female lawyer in France to plead before the Court of Assizes. That is the criminal court where serious cases are tried. But she did not achieve this until 1919. 1919. After World War I had already ended, after millions of men had died and women had proven they could do literally any job that needed doing, and even then, even after everything had changed, Maria and other female lawyers faced constant discrimination. Male lawyers would refuse to work with them. Judges would be openly dismissive. Clients would specifically request male lawyers because they did not trust women to be competent. Maria spent decades fighting this. She eventually became the president of the French League for Women's Rights, and dedicated her life to trying to change laws and attitudes. But can you imagine the frustration? The absolute grinding frustration of being brilliant and qualified and still having to fight every single day just to be taken seriously. Actually, maybe you can imagine it. Maybe some of you listening to this have experienced similar things in your own lives. The world has changed a lot since 1900, but let me tell you, some of these patterns are depressingly familiar. But I want to focus on England for a bit, because the English situation was particularly hypocritical. England prided itself on being civilized, on being a nation of laws and reason, and yet when it came to educating women and allowing them to use that education, England was as backwards as anywhere else. Women started gaining admission to some universities in England in the 1870s and 80s, but there were all these bizarre restrictions. At Cambridge University, for example, women could attend lectures and take examinations, but they could not actually receive degrees. They could do all the work, prove they'd learned everything, and then be told, "Sorry, no degree for you. You're just auditing," for decades. Cambridge did not grant full degrees to women until 1948. 1948, after 2 world wars, after women had been flying planes and breaking codes and running entire industries, after it was completely obvious that women were just as capable as men. Cambridge still held out until 1948. But let us talk about what happened to the women who did manage to get some form of education and wanted to actually do something with it. Because this is where things get really interesting and really frustrating. There was a movement in the late Victorian and Edwardian period toward what they called rational professions for women. These were jobs that society deemed acceptable for educated middle-class or upper-class women. And the list was very, very short. Teaching was acceptable. Specifically, teaching young children or teaching other girls. You could be a governess, you could run a girls' school, that was fine, because teaching children and other women was seen as an extension of women's natural, maternal instincts. It was not threatening. Nursing was acceptable, though it was still seen as somewhat lower class. Florence Nightingale had done a lot to make nursing respectable, but there was still this sense that nurses were more like servants than professionals. And that was basically it. Those were your options if you were an educated woman who wanted to work, teaching or nursing, that was the list. Everything else, medicine, law, engineering, business, science, no, 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 and no. Those professions were for men. They required masculine qualities, rationality, decisiveness, emotional detachment. Women were too emotional, too weak, too prone to hysteria to handle these responsibilities. This is what they actually believed, or at least this is what they claimed to believe. I suspect many of them knew it was nonsense, but found it convenient to maintain the fiction. So what did educated, ambitious women do? Some of them found creative workarounds. Let me tell you about some of the strategies they used. First, there was the strategy of working behind the scenes. You find a man, often a husband, sometimes a brother or father, who was willing to put his name on your work. You do the research, you write the papers, you develop the ideas. He presents them to the world as his own. You get none of the credit, but at least your ideas get out there. This happened all the time in science. There are so many discoveries and papers from the late Victorian and Edwardian periods where historians now believe that the man who got credit actually had a wife or sister doing most of the intellectual heavy lifting. But we will never know for certain in many cases because the women kept quiet. They had to. If they spoke up and said, "Actually, I did that work," they would be accused of being attention-seeking or lying, or trying to steal credit from men, so they stayed silent. Second, there was the strategy of using male pseudonyms. If you wanted to write serious fiction or non-fiction, if you wanted to be taken seriously as a writer, you published under a man's name. The Bronte sisters did this in the previous generation. Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell instead of Charlotte, Emily and Anne Bronte, George Eliot instead of Mary Ann Evans. And it worked. When books were published under male names, they got serious reviews. Critics took them seriously. They were discussed as important literature. When the same books were revealed to be written by women, suddenly the tone changed. Oh, it is quite good for a woman writer. Remarkable that a lady could write something so intellectually complex. Let us all be very surprised that a female brain produced this. The condescension is breathtaking, is it not? Third, there was the strategy of specializing in something so new or so niche that men had not yet decided it was important enough to monopolize. This is how some women managed to build careers in emerging fields. If you got in early enough before the establishment realized this new field might be prestigious or lucrative, you might be able to carve out a space for yourself. But here is the catch with all of these strategies. They required women to either hide who they were or work twice as hard as men for half the recognition, or limit themselves to marginal areas that nobody else wanted anyway. None of these strategies involved women actually getting equal treatment. They were all just different ways of working around an unjust system while leaving the system itself intact. And that brings me to what I think is the most frustrating part of this whole story. The women who did manage to get educated, who did manage to build some kind of career or public presence, they faced a choice that men never had to face. They had to choose between having a career or having a family. They could not have both. Society would not allow it. If you were a woman doctor, and there were a handful by the early 1900s, though it was incredibly difficult, you were expected to be unmarried. If you got married, you were expected to give up your practice, because a married woman's primary duty was to her husband and children. She could not possibly manage a medical practice and a household, and if she tried, if she insisted on continuing to work after marriage, she would be criticized as a neglectful wife, a bad mother, someone who was shirking her natural responsibilities. Men never had to make this choice. A male doctor could have a thriving practice and a wife and 6 children, and nobody questioned whether he could manage it all. In fact, having a wife and children made him seem more respectable, more stable, more suited for his profession. But women, you pick one, career or family. You do not get both. And even if you picked career, even if you decided to stay unmarried and dedicate yourself entirely to your profession, you still faced enormous obstacles. You were paid less than male colleagues with the same qualifications. You were passed over for promotions. You were excluded from professional societies and clubs where real networking and decision-making happened. You were treated as an oddity, something to be tolerated but not truly accepted. I want to read you something from a letter written by a woman doctor in 1908. She wrote, "I have proven myself more capable than most of my male colleagues. I have saved more lives, made fewer mistakes, worked harder hours, and yet I am paid half what they are paid, and I am not invited to the meetings where hospital policy is decided. My opinion is never solicited. I am a ghost in my own profession." A ghost in her own profession. Can you imagine working so hard to get somewhere, overcoming so many obstacles, and then discovering that even after you arrive you are still invisible? This was the reality for the new woman. She was told that education would liberate her. She was told that if she worked hard enough, if she proved herself capable enough, she would be treated as an equal. She believed these promises, and then she discovered they were lies. The cage was still there. It had just gotten slightly larger and more complicated. Instead of being trapped in the drawing room, she was now trapped in a system that allowed her to see what was possible but prevented her from fully achieving it. In some ways, that was even more cruel, because now she knew exactly what she was missing. And here is the ultimate irony. When these educated women expressed frustration at these barriers, When they demanded to be treated fairly, they were accused of being unfeminine, unnatural, hysterical. They were told that their ambition was unwomanly, that their intelligence made them unattractive, that they were betraying their nature by wanting careers instead of just focusing on being wives and mothers. The very qualities that made them successful, intelligence, ambition, determination, independence, were the same qualities that society said made them failures as women. You could not win. The game was rigged from the start. But here's what I find inspiring even in the middle of all this frustration and injustice. The new women kept fighting. They kept pushing boundaries. They kept demanding more. They organized. They created networks of support with other women. They founded their own professional associations when they were excluded from the male ones. They published in their own journals when mainstream publications would not take them seriously. They were building something, slowly, painfully, with enormous resistance at every step. But they were building the foundation for change, and they knew, at least the smarter ones knew, that real change was not going to come from individual women being exceptional enough to overcome the barriers. Real change was going to require changing the entire system, changing the laws, changing social attitudes, changing who had power and how that power was exercised. That is why so many of these educated women became involved in the suffrage movement. Because they understood that until women had political power, until women could vote and run for office and influence legislation, nothing fundamental was going to change. They could have all the education in the world, but without political power, they were still second-class citizens. And that leads us directly to what we need to talk about next. Because motherhood, the thing that society kept telling women was their highest calling, their natural destiny, the only role that really mattered. Motherhood itself was a trap in so many ways. The medical realities of pregnancy and childbirth in this era were genuinely terrifying. Women had no control over if or when they got pregnant. They had no access to birth control. They had no choice about how many children they had. And childbirth was dangerous, really dangerous. It was one of the leading causes of death for women of childbearing age. So in our next part, we need to talk about the dark reality of motherhood before modern medicine. We need to talk about what happened to women's bodies when they had 8, 10, 12 pregnancies. We need to talk about the baby farming scandals and infant mortality, and all the ways that wealth could not protect women from the dangers of simply trying to have children. Because this is another piece of the puzzle, another way that women were trapped and controlled. And it is time we shined a light on it. They told women that motherhood was their highest calling, their sacred duty, the ultimate fulfillment of their purpose on earth. They romanticized it in paintings and poetry, the beautiful mother cradling her infant, the perfect picture of domestic bliss. What they did not tell women was that pregnancy could kill you, that childbirth was one of the most dangerous things you would ever experience, that even if you survived, your body might be permanently damaged, that you had absolutely no choice in how many times you would go through this, because birth control was illegal, inaccessible, or condemned by society. They called it a blessing. But for many women, it was a death sentence handed out one pregnancy at a time. Let me start with a number that I need you to really sit with. In the early 1900s, maternal mortality, that means women dying in childbirth or from pregnancy complications, was the leading cause of death for women between the ages of 20 and 40. The leading cause, not disease, not accidents, not anything else, childbirth. And we are not talking about rare isolated incidents. We're talking about something that happened so regularly that every woman knew someone. A sister, a friend, a neighbour, a cousin, who had died giving birth. It was common enough that when a woman discovered she was pregnant, there was always this shadow in the back of her mind. This might be the pregnancy that kills me. Wealthy women, aristocratic women with access to the best doctors and the finest care, they were not safe either. In fact, in some ways, the medical interventions available to wealthy women actually made things more dangerous. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me walk you through what pregnancy and childbirth actually looked like in this era. First, let us talk about pregnancy itself. Today, if you get pregnant, you can take a test after just a few weeks. You can see a doctor, get prenatal care, monitor the baby's development, identify potential problems early. In 1900, you just had to wait and see. Many women did not even know for certain they were pregnant until several months in, when the baby started moving. And once you knew you were pregnant, there was very little medical support available. You might see a doctor once or twice during the entire pregnancy if you were wealthy. Poor women might never see a doctor at all. There was no way to monitor the baby's heartbeat, no way to check if the baby was positioned correctly, no way to identify if there were going to be complications until you were actually in labour, and it was too late to do anything about them. So women just waited. 9 months of waiting and wondering and hoping that everything would be okay. And then came labour. Let me tell you about childbirth in the Edwardian era, because this is where things get truly terrifying. If you were an aristocratic woman, you gave birth at home. Hospitals were for poor people, so when your labour started, they would prepare a room in your house, usually your bedroom, and that is where you would spend anywhere from a few hours to several days in labour. Because yes, labours could last for days. 36 hours, 48 hours, sometimes longer. Just hours and hours of pain with no epidural, no pain medication that really worked. Nothing to help except maybe some chloroform if things got really desperate. And that carried its own risks. You would have a doctor if you were wealthy, though many doctors in this era knew surprisingly little about childbirth. This might sound strange, but for most of medical history, childbirth was considered women's business. Midwives handled it. Doctors did not get involved unless there was a serious problem. So when wealthy women started insisting on having doctors present for births, these doctors often had less practical experience than the midwives they were replacing. And some of the things doctors did actually made births more dangerous. Let me give you an example that is genuinely shocking. In the mid to late 1800s and into the early 1900s, there was a huge problem with something called childbed fever, also known as puerperal sepsis. This was an infection that women would get after giving birth, and it killed thousands upon thousands of new mothers. A doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis figured out in the 1840s that the infection was being spread by doctors themselves. They would go directly from performing autopsies or examining other patients to delivering babies, and they would not wash their hands. He proved that if doctors simply washed their hands with a chlorine solution before deliveries, the rate of childbed fever dropped dramatically. But the medical establishment rejected his findings. They were insulted by the suggestion that doctors, educated, refined gentlemen, could be causing infections. How dare this upstart suggest that they were killing their patients? Semmelweis was mocked, ridiculed, eventually committed to an asylum where he died. And women kept dying of childbed fever for decades because doctors refused to believe that washing their hands would make a difference. It was not until the 1890s, when germ theory became widely accepted, that doctors finally started consistently washing their hands and sterilizing their instruments. That is 50 years of unnecessary deaths. 50 years of women dying because doctors were too proud to consider that they might be part of the problem. Even after doctors started taking hygiene seriously, childbirth remained incredibly dangerous. There were so many things that could go wrong, and medicine just did not have answers for most of them. The baby could be positioned wrong, breech birth, where the feet or bottom come first instead of the head. Today, doctors can often turn the baby before labour starts, or they can perform a caesarean section. In 1900, if the baby was breech and could not be turned, the mother and baby both often died. Doctors had forceps, metal instruments that could grab the baby's head and pull, but using forceps required skill and often caused terrible injuries to both mother and baby. Crushed skulls, torn tissue, hemorrhaging. Many women who survived forceps deliveries were left with permanent damage. Then there was the problem of hemorrhaging. If a woman started bleeding too heavily after birth, there was very little doctors could do. Blood transfusions were still experimental and dangerous. They did not understand blood types until the early 1900s, so transfusions often killed the patient. So if a woman hemorrhaged, the doctor would try to stop the bleeding manually, and if that did not work, they would just watch her bleed to death. There was nothing else they could do. Caesarean sections existed, but they were a last resort because they were so dangerous. The surgery itself could kill you from blood loss. The anesthesia could kill you. The infection afterward could kill you. Most women who had caesarean sections in the early 1900s did not survive. It was not until antibiotics became available in the 1940s that caesarean sections became relatively safe. So women went into childbirth knowing that there were a dozen ways they could die, and medicine could not prevent most of them. That takes a kind of courage I honestly cannot fully comprehend. And if you survived, if you made it through labour and delivery, and the dangerous weeks afterward when infection was most likely, you still might be permanently damaged. Pelvic organ prolapse, where the uterus or bladder drops because the pelvic floor muscles have been destroyed. Fistulas, which are tears between the vagina and bladder or rectum that cause constant leaking and infection. Chronic pain, incontinence, nerve damage. Many women suffered through multiple pregnancies with untreated birth injuries because talking about these problems was considered indelicate. You were supposed to bear it quietly. Seeking help meant discussing your body in ways that were considered improper for a lady, so women just lived with it. Years of pain and dysfunction, never speaking about it, never getting treatment. Now, let me ask you something. How many children do you think the average aristocratic woman had in this era? Take a guess. 5, 6, try 8 to 10, sometimes more. There are records of aristocratic women having 12, 13, even 15 pregnancies. Not all of those pregnancies resulted in living children. Miscarriages and stillbirths were common. But we are talking about women going through this terrifying, potentially fatal experience over and over and over again. And here is the thing. They had no choice. Birth control was basically non-existent for aristocratic women. It existed for prostitutes and working-class women. There were various methods, some more effective than others, but they were all considered scandalous and improper. A respectable married woman was not supposed to know about such things, let alone use them. The only socially acceptable way to avoid pregnancy was abstinence, which meant convincing your husband not to exercise his legal right to have sex with you whenever he wanted. And we've already talked about how much power women had in their marriages, so you can imagine how well that worked out. So women just kept getting pregnant, again and again, until they died, or until they reached menopause, or until their bodies had been so damaged by multiple pregnancies that they could not get pregnant anymore. Queen Victoria herself had 9 children. 9, and she hated being pregnant. She wrote letters describing pregnancy as the shadow side of marriage and comparing herself to a cow or a dog. She called babies ugly and frog-like. She resented the whole process, but she kept having children because that was what was expected. That was her duty as a wife and queen. And if Queen Victoria, with all her power and wealth and status, could not escape this fate, what hope did ordinary aristocratic women have? Now I want to tell you about something that is going to make you feel sick. It is called baby farming, and it is one of the darkest chapters in Victorian and Edwardian history. Baby farming was the practice of paying someone to take care of your baby for you. Usually, This happened when unmarried women got pregnant. And remember, being an unmarried mother was social death in this era. These women would have the baby in secret, then pay a baby farmer to take the infant and care for it. Sounds reasonable, right? Except many baby farmers had no intention of actually caring for these babies. They would take the payment, take the baby, and then kill it. Sometimes through deliberate murder, sometimes through neglect, not feeding the baby enough, keeping it in filthy conditions until it died of disease or starvation. And because these babies were illegitimate, because their mothers were desperate to hide their existence, these deaths often went unreported and uninvestigated. The most notorious baby farmer was a woman named Amelia Dyer. She operated in the late 1800s. Official records show she was convicted of murdering one baby and confirmed to be involved in the deaths of 6 others, but historians believe she may have killed as many as 400 infants. 400. Over a period of about 20 years, she may have murdered 400 babies. Think about that number. Think about how many desperate mothers must have paid her, trusting her to care for their babies, and instead she killed them. She would advertise her services, meet with mothers, take the baby and the payment, and then either strangle the infant or just let it die of starvation. Amelia Dyer was eventually caught in 1896 and hanged for her crimes, but the case sparked a huge scandal because it revealed just how widespread baby farming was and how many babies were dying because of it. The government was forced to pass stricter laws regulating adoption and childcare, but the damage had been done. Hundreds, maybe thousands of babies had died because unwed mothers had nowhere else to turn. And here is the connection to aristocratic women. Because this was happening in their world too, just in slightly different ways. Aristocratic women who had affairs sometimes got pregnant. What happened to those babies? They could not exactly raise them openly. That would be scandalous. So they would pay servants or distant relatives to take the baby and raise it elsewhere. Some of these children were cared for properly. Others just disappeared. Nobody asked too many questions because nobody wanted to know the answers. The difference between social classes was not in whether this happened, but in how much money was available to hide it and who got blamed when things went wrong. Working-class women who became baby farmers were hanged. Aristocratic families who made similar arrangements just called it discretion and moved on. Let me tell you about one more aspect of motherhood that nobody talks about. Postpartum depression. We know now that this is a real medical condition caused by hormonal changes after birth. It can be severe. It can be dangerous. Women with postpartum depression sometimes have thoughts of harming themselves or their babies. In 1900, postpartum depression did not have a name. It was just more evidence of female hysteria. If a new mother was sad or anxious or having disturbing thoughts, she was told to pull herself together, to count her blessings, to be grateful for her beautiful baby. If she continued to struggle, she might be diagnosed as insane and institutionalized. Imagine going through the trauma of childbirth, surviving it by sheer luck, and then falling into a deep depression because of the hormonal tsunami happening in your body. And instead of getting help, instead of receiving compassion and treatment, you're told you are going insane, that you are a bad mother, that you are failing at the one thing women are supposed to be naturally good at. How many women suffered through this alone? How many of them believed they really were insane because that's what everyone told them? How many of them harmed themselves because they saw no other way out of the darkness? Motherhood was supposed to be women's highest calling, but the reality was that it was dangerous, painful, traumatic, and relentless, and women had no choice about whether or not to go through it. They could not choose not to have children. They could not choose how many children to have. They could not even choose how much pain they would endure during birth, because pain medication was considered dangerous or improper or both. Their bodies were not their own. Their bodies belonged to their husbands, to society, to the expectation that women would produce children no matter the cost to their health, or happiness, or lives. And yet, and this is what kills me, and yet this was romanticized, celebrated, portrayed as the ultimate feminine fulfillment. Women were told they should be grateful for the opportunity to suffer and possibly die in order to have children. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. The same society that claimed to protect and cherish women was systematically destroying their bodies and sometimes killing them through pregnancy and childbirth, and calling it a blessing. But we are almost at the end of this dark journey. We have just a few more pieces to put together before we can understand what happened when World War I finally shattered this world. And one of those pieces involves understanding just how deeply these women internalized the messages they were given. How completely they believed that their suffering was normal, that their pain was necessary, that their lack of choices was natural. Because in the next part we need to talk about the ultimate tragedy, the ways that women turned their suffering inward, the epidemic of suicide among women in this era, and why drowning became romanticized as the proper way for a fallen woman to die. We need to talk about the art that glorified female death and the reality of female despair. We need to talk about the women who looked at the world they lived in and decided that death was preferable to continuing. This is going to be heavy. This is going to be dark. But we are almost through. Almost to the point where everything changes. And we need to understand the full depth of what women endured before we can appreciate what it meant when the old world finally fell apart. Stay with me just a little longer. Victorian England had a strange obsession with beautiful dead women. Walk through any art gallery with paintings from this era, and you will see them everywhere. Women floating in rivers, women lying peacefully in death, women with flowers in their hair and serene expressions on their pale faces. The most famous is probably John Everett Millais' painting of Ophelia from Shakespeare's Hamlet, showing her floating in a stream surrounded by flowers, looking almost angelic in death. It is a gorgeous painting, hauntingly beautiful, and it represents one of the most toxic ideas of the Victorian and Edwardian eras. The notion that for a fallen woman, for a woman who had been compromised or ruined, or who had simply failed to live up to society's impossible standards, death, specifically death by drowning, was not just acceptable but somehow redemptive. Society made suicide look beautiful, and then they were shocked when women actually did it. Let me tell you about a phrase that historians use when discussing Victorian suicide. They call it the feminization of suicide. And what that means is something really specific and really disturbing. Throughout most of history, men committed suicide at higher rates than women. That is still true today, by the way. But during the Victorian and Edwardian periods, something changed in how society thought about and talked about suicide. Suicide became culturally associated with women. Not because women were actually committing suicide more than men, the statistics do not support that, but because Victorian culture became obsessed with the image of the suicidal woman, the fallen woman standing at the edge of a bridge, the ruined maiden walking into the river, the desperate girl taking poison in her room, and more than 80% of verdicts that use the term unsound mind, or what they called the medium verdict, meaning the person was not entirely responsible for their actions, occurred between 1880 and 1900. That tells us something really important. During exactly the period we are talking about, during La Belle Époque and the Edwardian era, society was dealing with an epidemic of female suicide. Or at least they were confronting the reality of it in ways they had not before. Now, why 1880 to 1900? What was happening during those specific years that made suicide such a pressing issue? Well, think about everything we have talked about in this story so far. Women trapped in abusive marriages with no legal way out. Women having their children taken away by courts that did not care about maternal rights. Women being committed to asylums by husbands who wanted to get rid of them. Women being forced into marriages they did not want. Women watching their bodies be destroyed by pregnancy after pregnancy. Women who were educated but not allowed to use that education. Women who wanted autonomy but were told they were property. Is it any wonder that some of them looked at their lives and decided they could not continue? Is it any wonder that death started to look like the only escape? But here is where Victorian society did something particularly cruel. They did not just have an epidemic of female suicide, they romanticized it. They made it into art. They turned female death into something beautiful and tragic and somehow noble. Let me tell you about the paintings I mentioned. John Everett Millay's Ophelia was painted in 1851 to 1852, but it remained enormously popular throughout the Victorian and Edwardian periods. The model who posed for it, Elizabeth Siddal, had to lie in a bathtub of water for hours while Millay painted. The water was supposed to be heated by lamps underneath, but the lamps went out at one point and she nearly got hypothermia. She got seriously ill afterward. All so Millay could create this perfect image of a beautiful dead woman floating in water. And the painting became iconic. It was reproduced constantly. People hung copies in their homes. It influenced how people thought about female death. The floating woman surrounded by flowers became a visual shorthand for tragic femininity. Then there was George Frederick Watts's painting Found Drowned, painted in the 1840s and 50s. It shows the body of a woman who has just been pulled from the Thames. She is lying under an arch of a bridge. In the background you can see the lights of the city. The painting is dark and sombre, but even in death the woman is portrayed as beautiful, peaceful, almost as if drowning was a kind of relief. These paintings and others like them created what historians call the romantic stereotype of female suicide. And the stereotype was very specific. A young woman, usually described as fallen or ruined or seduced, standing near water. Just that image, a woman near water, immediately suggested to Victorian audiences that she was about to kill herself. It became so common, so accepted, that it stopped seeming tragic and started seeming almost natural. Of course the fallen woman would drown herself. What else would she do? She has been ruined. She has no future. Death by drowning is her only option. And look how peaceful she looks. Look how the water washes away her sins. This is genuinely one of the most disturbing things about Victorian culture. They took female desperation and suffering and turned it into aesthetic objects. They made suicide look beautiful. And then when real women actually drowned themselves in the Thames or other rivers, newspapers would report on it in language that echoed these paintings. They would describe the woman's beauty, her peaceful expression, how tragic it all was. But they would not talk about why she did it. They would not talk about the abuse or the poverty or the lack of options. They would not talk about the systematic failures that drove her to that bridge or that riverbank. They would just say, "Oh, how see, another fallen woman has ended her life. How romantic, how tragic, how Victorian." Do you see what they were doing? They were taking real suffering and real desperation and turning it into entertainment, into art, into something consumers could look at and feel a pleasant melancholy about, without actually having to confront the systemic problems that caused it. Now let me give you some statistics that tell a different story than the romantic paintings. In urban England during the late Victorian period, drowning was indeed one of the most common methods of suicide for women. But do you know what the actual bodies of drowning victims looked like when they were pulled from the river? Nothing like the paintings. Nothing like Ophelia floating peacefully surrounded by flowers. Real drowning victims were bloated. Their skin was muddy and discoloured, their clothes were torn, their hair was matted. There was nothing peaceful or beautiful or romantic about it. It was tragic and ugly and horrible, the way death usually is. But society preferred the fantasy. They preferred to think of suicidal women as these ethereal beings who just gently floated away, rather than as desperate people who jumped off bridges in terror and drowned in cold, filthy water, while probably regretting their choice but unable to save themselves. And here is the really insidious part. Art imitating life, imitating art. Real women who were considering suicide were influenced by these images. They knew that drowning was considered the proper way for a fallen woman to die. They had seen the paintings, they had read the poems, so when they decided to end their lives, drowning seemed like the right choice, the expected choice, the way it was supposed to happen. Cultural critic Margaret Higonnet described female suicide as a cultural obsession of the Victorian people, and historian Olive Anderson documented that the drowned female had become so completely familiar to Victorian society that just the image of a woman standing near water would immediately suggest to viewers that she was deserted or fallen and about to kill herself. Think about how dark that is. The image became so common that people immediately assumed woman plus water equals suicide. That is the level of cultural saturation we are talking about. But not all female suicides in this era involved drowning. Poison was also extremely common, and we've already talked about how accessible poison was. Women would take arsenic or laudanum, which was an opium-based medicine that was legal and widely available. They would do it quietly in their rooms, and sometimes they would not be discovered until it was too late. There are records of aristocratic women who committed suicide this way. Usually their families would try to cover it up. They would claim it was an accident or a sudden illness. Because suicide was not just tragic, it was scandalous. It was a sin. It was illegal. Yes, illegal. Attempted suicide was a crime in England until 1961. If you tried to kill yourself and survived, you could be arrested and prosecuted. And if you died, your body could not be buried in consecrated ground. You could not have a proper Christian funeral. Your family would be shamed. So families with money and influence would lie. They would bribe doctors to write different causes of death on the certificates. They would have quiet, private funerals and never speak of it again. How many aristocratic women killed themselves, and we will never know because their families successfully covered it up? How many women's deaths were attributed to accidents or sudden illness when really they were suicides born of desperation? We will never have accurate numbers, but we know it happened. We know it happened frequently enough that the cover-ups became routine, frequently enough that there were established procedures for how to handle it, frequently enough that everyone in high society knew it was happening, even if nobody talked about it openly. Let me tell you about what the legal system called the medium verdict. And this was a verdict that coroners could give in cases of suicide that basically said, yes, this person killed themselves, but they were not in their right mind when they did it. So we are not going to treat it as a crime, and we are not going to deny them burial. The medium verdict was supposed to be merciful. It acknowledged that sometimes people kill themselves because of mental illness or temporary insanity, not because they are morally corrupt. And over 80% of all medium verdicts in the 19th century occurred between 1880 and 1900. Why is that significant? Because it tells us that during exactly the period we are discussing, suicide became such a widespread problem that the legal system had to create a workaround. They had to find a way to deal with all these suicides without treating every case as a crime. And historians believe that the medium verdict was used more frequently for women than for men, because society was more willing to believe that a woman who killed herself must have been insane or hysterical or not in control of her faculties. Men who committed suicide were more likely to be judged harshly as having failed in some fundamental way. But women? Oh, women are naturally emotional and unstable. Of course she was not in her right mind. Let us give her a proper burial and move on. The sexism cuts both ways, doesn't it? Women were infantilized even in death. Their suicides were not taken as seriously as men's suicides because women were not taken seriously in general. Now I want to talk about something that does not get discussed enough in histories of this period. The connection between suicide and social ruin. Because in Victorian and Edwardian society, there were so many ways a woman could be ruined. And once you were ruined, once your reputation was destroyed, there was often no way back. If you had an affair and got caught, you were ruined. If you had a baby outside of marriage, you were ruined. If you were divorced, even if the divorce was your husband's fault, you were ruined. If you were raped and people found out about it, you were ruined. If you were just accused of impropriety, even without proof, you could be ruined. And what did ruin mean? It meant social death. You would not be invited to parties anymore. Your friends would stop calling. Your family might disown you. You would not be able to marry. Who would want damaged goods? You would have no social standing, no prospects, no future. For women whose entire identity and security came from their social position, ruin was genuinely catastrophic. It was not just embarrassing or inconvenient. It was the end of everything they knew, the end of the only life they'd been trained for. When faced with ruin, some women decided that actual death was preferable to social death. At least if you were dead, people might remember you with some sympathy. At least you would not have to endure years of being shunned and whispered about. At least you would not have to watch your family suffer the shame of being associated with you. The paintings of beautiful drowned women reinforced this idea. They suggested that suicide was a kind of redemption, that death could wash away sin, that a ruined woman could recover her honor by dying beautifully and tragically. It is poison, pure ideological poison. Taking vulnerable, desperate women and convincing them that their deaths would be noble and romantic instead of what they actually were, preventable tragedies caused by a cruel and unforgiving society. And here is the worst part. When women did kill themselves, when they could not take the pressure anymore and ended their lives, society would shake its head sadly and say, "What a tragedy! Such a waste! If only she had been stronger. If only she had not been so weak and emotional. If only she had made better choices. Never. If only we had not destroyed her for being human. If only we had not made her life unbearable. If only we had given her options other than death or ruin." The blame always fell on the woman herself. Even in death, even in the ultimate act of desperation, it was still her fault. I have been thinking a lot as I researched this period about what it must have been like to be a woman during La Belle Époque, to live in a world that looked so beautiful on the surface, that promised so much elegance and refinement and culture, but underneath, everything was rotting. Everything was designed to control you and limit you and punish you for being fully human. And some women looked at that beautiful rotten world and decided they would rather die than continue living in it. And society painted pictures of their deaths and called them romantic. But we are almost at the end of this dark journey through pre-war aristocratic life. We have just 3 more parts to go, and in the next one we need to talk about the women who did not give up, the women who fought back, not with poison or by drowning themselves in rivers, but by organizing, by demanding rights, by refusing to accept that their suffering was inevitable. We need to talk about the suffragettes and the labour organisers and the women who looked at the system and said, "No, this ends now. We are going to change this, whatever it takes." Because that resistance was building all through the period we have been discussing. While some women were drowning in the Thames, others were marching in the streets. While some women were dying in childbirth, others were fighting for the right to access birth control information. While some women were being locked in asylums, others were demanding legal reforms. The cage was still there, but women were starting to break the bars, and the sound of those bars breaking was terrifying to everyone who benefited from keeping women trapped. Stay with me. We are entering the final phase of this story, the part where everything starts to change. On June the 4th, 1913, a woman named Emily Wilding Davison walked onto the Epsom Derby racetrack during the most famous horse race in England. The King's horse was thundering toward her. Thousands of spectators were watching. Cameras were rolling. This was one of the first major sporting events to be filmed. Emily stepped out onto the track, raised her hands, and tried to grab the reins of the King's horse. The horse hit her at full speed. She was trampled. Her skull was fractured. 4 days later, she died from her injuries. And the question that everyone asked then, and that historians still debate today, is, was she trying to commit suicide? Or was she trying to do something else entirely? Something so bold and desperate that she was willing to risk her life but not necessarily intending to die? The truth is, we will never know for certain what was in Emily's mind at that moment. But what we do know is this: she was a suffragette. She had dedicated her life to fighting for women's right to vote. She'd been arrested 9 times. She'd been force-fed in prison after going on hunger strike. She had hidden in a broom closet in the Houses of Parliament overnight so she could claim it as her legal residence. An act of protest that was both hilarious and deadly serious. And on that day in June 1913, she decided that the cause was worth risking everything. Welcome to the story of the women who fought back. The women who refused to accept that their suffering was inevitable. The women who looked at the system we have been discussing for the past 9 parts of this story and said, "No more. We are going to change this no matter what it costs us." Let me take you back a bit, because the fight for women's rights did not start in 1913. It had been building for decades. All through the late 1800s and early 1900s, while society was crushing women with corsets and marriage laws and impossible expectations, some women were organising, planning, fighting back in whatever ways they could. The suffrage movement, the fight for women's right to vote, had been going on since the mid-1800s, but it was considered a radical, even dangerous idea. The argument against women's suffrage was that women were too emotional, too irrational, too influenced by their husbands to vote independently, that giving women the vote would destroy the family structure, that it was against nature, against God's plan. And for decades, the women fighting for suffrage were polite. They were patient, they wrote letters, they gave speeches, they formed organisations, they presented petitions to Parliament with hundreds of thousands of signatures. They did everything the proper way, the respectable way, the way that society said they should express their concerns. And they were ignored, completely ignored. Year after year, decade after decade, their petitions were dismissed, their arguments were mocked, and nothing changed. So around 1903, some women decided that politeness was not working. They decided it was time to make some noise, and thus were born the Suffragettes, a term that was originally meant to be insulting, to diminish them by making them sound small and silly, but which they embraced and turned into a badge of honour. The difference between suffragists and suffragettes is important. Suffragists use peaceful legal methods, petitions, speeches, lobbying. Suffragettes used what they called militant tactics. They broke windows, they set fires, they chained themselves to railings. They disrupted political meetings, they refused to be ignored, and the establishment responded with brutal force. Let me tell you about force feeding, because this is one of the most horrifying aspects of how the British government treated suffragettes. When suffragettes were arrested and sent to prison, many of them would go on hunger strike. They refused to eat as a form of protest, and the government's response was to force-feed them. Imagine this. You are strapped to a chair, your head is held immobile, a tube is forced down your throat, sometimes through your nose if you keep your mouth clamped shut. Food is poured into the tube, you are gagging, choking, feeling like you're drowning. Your throat is torn and bleeding. You vomit. They force more food down. This happens multiple times per day. For weeks, for months. This was not medical treatment, this was torture. It was designed to break these women's spirits, to make them regret their protest, to make them so terrified of returning to prison that they would stop fighting. It did not work. The suffragettes kept fighting. There is a woman I want to tell you about named Emmeline Pankhurst. She founded the Women's Social and Political Union in 1903, which became the most famous suffragette organisation. Emmeline was middle-aged when she started this fight. She was in her 40s, and she'd already lived through loss and hardship. Her husband had died. She had 4 children to support. She was not some naive young radical. She was a woman who had seen enough of life to know exactly what she was up against. Emmeline was arrested multiple times. She was imprisoned. She was force-fed, and she kept fighting. Her famous slogan was "Deeds, not words." She believed that women had spent too long asking nicely. It was time to demand, time to disrupt, time to make it impossible for the government to ignore them. Her daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, were also deeply involved in the movement. Christabel became one of the leaders of the militant wing. Sylvia focused more on working-class women's rights, and eventually broke with her mother over tactics and philosophy. The Pankhurst family was fascinating and complicated, and their internal conflicts reflect the broader tensions within the suffrage movement. Because here is something important to understand. The suffrage movement was not unified. There were deep class divisions. Many of the prominent suffragettes came from middle-class or even aristocratic backgrounds. They had education, they had resources, they could afford to be arrested because they had families who could support them or money to pay fines. Working-class women were fighting too, but their fight was more complicated. If they were arrested, they might lose their jobs, their families might starve. They did not have the luxury of being full-time activists because they had to work for survival, and some of the wealthier suffragettes were, frankly, a bit oblivious to this. They talked about women's rights in abstract terms without always recognizing that working-class women faced additional barriers that had nothing to do with the vote. A working-class woman could not vote, yes, but she also could not afford to eat properly, could not afford decent housing, was working 16-hour days in a factory, and coming home to care for 6 children. The vote was important, critically important, but it was not going to solve all those other problems automatically. Sylvia Pankhurst recognized this. She eventually split from the mainstream suffragette movement to focus on the rights of working-class women specifically. She organized in London's East End, where poverty was crushing and women were struggling just to survive. She understood that you could not separate women's suffrage from labour rights, from access to healthcare, from economic justice. But I want to come back to Emily Davison for a moment, because her story captures something essential about this movement. Emily was educated. She had attended Oxford, though of course she was not allowed to receive a degree. She was a teacher. She was also willing to put her body on the line for this cause. Before the Derby incident, Emily had already engaged in numerous acts of militant protest. She had been arrested multiple times. She had set fire to postboxes, which was a common suffragette tactic because it disrupted communication and caused chaos without directly hurting anyone. She had hidden overnight in the Houses of Parliament, emerging the next day to claim that she now had a legal right to vote because she resided in the Palace of Westminster. That last one makes me smile. It was so clever, so audacious, and so perfectly calculated to make the establishment look ridiculous. But back to the Derby. When Emily stepped onto that racetrack, she was carrying 2 suffragette flags hidden in her coat. Some historians believe she was trying to attach one of the flags to the king's horse, a symbolic gesture that would be captured on film and broadcast around the world. She may not have intended to die. She may have misjudged the speed of the horse or thought she could dodge it after making her point. Or maybe she knew exactly what she was doing. Maybe she had decided that martyrdom would serve the cause better than continued protest. We will never know. What we do know is that her funeral was massive. Thousands of women marched in the procession. It became a huge public event. And her death became a rallying point for the movement. Whether she intended it or not, Emily's death forced people to pay attention, forced them to ask, what kind of society drives women to such desperate acts? The suffragette movement was gaining momentum in the years leading up to World War I, but they were also facing enormous opposition. It was not just men opposing them, though plenty of men did, with arguments ranging from paternalistic concern to outright misogyny. Many women opposed suffrage too. There were anti-suffrage organisations run by women who believed that giving women the vote would destroy femininity, would ruin the special protected status that women supposedly enjoyed, would thrust women into the dirty world of politics where they did not belong. These anti-suffrage women were often from aristocratic or upper-middle-class backgrounds. They had comfortable lives. They saw the suffragettes as vulgar and unladylike. They did not want the status quo to change because they benefited from it, or at least they thought they did. The irony is painful, isn't it? Women using their limited power to argue that women should not have power, but the suffragettes persisted. They were not asking permission anymore. They were demanding change, and they were willing to go to prison, to be force-fed, to be mocked and ridiculed and called hysterical to keep fighting. And here is what I find so powerful about this movement. These women understood something fundamental. They understood that all the suffering we have been talking about throughout this entire story, the corsets, the marriage market, the domestic violence, the lack of legal rights, the childbirth deaths, the suicides, all of it was connected. All of it stemmed from the same root cause. Women had no political power. As long as women could not vote, they could not influence legislation. As long as they could not influence legislation, the laws would continue to be written by men and for men. And as long as the laws were written by men and for men, women would remain trapped. The suffragettes understood that getting the vote was not the end goal. It was the beginning. It was the tool they needed to start changing everything else. Did they make mistakes? Yes. Were some of their tactics questionable? Absolutely. The arson attacks, the window breaking, the vandalism, these alienated some potential supporters. Some historians argue that the militant tactics actually delayed women getting the vote because they allowed opponents to portray suffragettes as dangerous radicals. But other historians point out that the peaceful tactics had failed for 50 years, that polite petitions were ignored, that sometimes disruption is necessary to create change, that powerful people do not give up power willingly, they have to be forced. I think there is truth in both perspectives. Social change is messy. It is complicated. It requires both the people who work within the system and the people who challenge the system from outside. It requires patience and disruption, negotiation and confrontation. What is undeniable is that the suffragettes changed the conversation. Before them, women's suffrage was a fringe issue that most people did not take seriously. After them, it was impossible to ignore. The question was no longer if women should have the right to vote, but when and how it would happen. And then, in August 1914, everything changed. Not because of the suffragettes, not because Parliament had finally been convinced, but because the world went to war. World War I erupted, and suddenly Britain needed every resource it had, including women. The Suffragettes remarkably suspended their campaign. Emmeline Pankhurst actually told her followers to support the war effort. The militants became patriots. Women poured into factories and hospitals and farms. They did the work that men had been doing before they went off to fight. And they proved definitively that they were just as capable as men, that all the arguments about women being too weak or too emotional or too irrational were complete nonsense. By the end of the war, it was impossible to justify denying women the vote. How could you send women into factories to build munitions, send them to hospitals to treat wounded soldiers, ask them to keep the entire home front running, and then tell them they were too incompetent to mark a ballot? In 1918, British women over the age of 30 who met certain property requirements were given the right to vote. It was not full equality. Men could vote at 21 regardless of property, but it was progress. It took another 10 years, until 1928, for British women to get voting rights equal to men. So Emily Davison died in 1913, just 1 year before the war that would change everything. She did not live to see women get the vote. She did not live to see the world she fought for. But her death was not meaningless. None of their struggles were meaningless. The suffragettes broke the bars of the cage. Not all the bars, not all at once, but they broke enough that other women could start to push through. They proved that women did not have to accept suffering and oppression as inevitable. They proved that fighting back was possible. And that brings us to the final pieces of this story. Because we need to talk about what happened when war finally came. We need to talk about how the aristocratic world we have been exploring, this beautiful, cruel, rigid world of La Belle Époque, was shattered by 4 years of unprecedented violence. We need to talk about what happened to aristocratic women when their husbands and sons went to war, when their country estates became hospitals, when the rules they had lived by suddenly did not apply anymore. Because World War I did not just change politics and national boundaries, it changed everything about how people lived and thought. And for women, especially aristocratic women, the war opened doors that could never be closed again. The cage was breaking, and in our next part, we are going to watch it fall apart completely. The summer of 1914 started out like every other season. The London social calendar was packed with balls and garden parties. Women were ordering new gowns from Paris. Families were planning their annual trips to the seaside or the countryside. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. And then, on June the 28th, a Serbian nationalist shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria in Sarajevo. Most people in England barely noticed. It seemed like just another political incident in the Balkans, tragic certainly, but not something that would affect them. Except this time the dominoes started falling. Austria declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia and France. And on August the 4th, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. And just like that, La Belle Époque was over. The beautiful era ended not with a whisper, but with the thunder of artillery fire. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. I want you to imagine what this must have felt like if you were an aristocratic woman in August 1914. Your entire life has been lived according to strict rules and expectations. You've been trained since childhood to be decorative, to be proper, to manage a household and raise children and host dinner parties. The most rebellious thing you have ever done might be wearing a slightly too daring dress or reading a novel your mother would not approve of. And suddenly, everything you knew is falling apart. Your husband enlists, your sons enlist. They put on uniforms and march away to fight in a war that everyone says will be over by Christmas. Except Christmas comes and goes and the war is still raging. And then another Christmas, and another. 4 years of war that was supposed to last 4 months. And you discover that you are capable of things you never imagined. Let me tell you about what happened to the great country estates during World War I, because this transformation is both symbolic and literal. These enormous houses, the ones with 50 rooms, the ones that required armies of servants to maintain, the ones where aristocratic families had lived in luxury for generations, they became hospitals. The British government needed places to treat wounded soldiers. Regular hospitals were overwhelmed, so country estates were converted. Ballrooms became wards, libraries became operating rooms, drawing rooms became recovery spaces. The women who had spent their lives hosting elegant parties suddenly found themselves rolling up their sleeves and learning to change bandages. And many of them were good at it, really good at it. There is a woman I need to tell you about. Her name was Marie, and she was Crown Princess of Romania, soon to be Queen Marie when her husband inherited the throne in 1914, right at the start of the war. Marie was British by birth, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and she had been raised with all the expectations and restrictions we have been discussing throughout this story. But when Romania entered the war in 1916, Marie transformed herself into something nobody expected. She became a nurse, not a ceremonial show-up-for-photographs nurse, a real nurse. She worked in hospitals that were overwhelmed with wounded soldiers, with epidemics of cholera and typhus. She exposed herself daily to diseases that were killing thousands. She tended to the dying. She held the hands of the soldiers who were taking their last breaths. A diplomat who observed her during this time, Count Czernin, the Austro-Hungarian ambassador, wrote that Romanian policy might well depend on Marie rather than on her husband, Crown Prince Ferdinand. He recognized something that people had not seen before. Marie had intelligence, strength, and political acumen that had been hidden beneath the decorative surface of her role as Crown Princess. The war revealed her, and it revealed thousands of other women like her. Women who had capabilities that society had never allowed them to use. Think about what a massive shift this was. Before the war, if you were an aristocratic woman, you were not supposed to work. Working was for people who needed money. You were supposed to be above such things. Your hands were supposed to be soft and white, never touched by labour. During the war, women who had never worked a day in their lives were suddenly doing 12-hour shifts in hospitals. They were dealing with blood and gangrene and amputations. They were making life and death decisions. They were managing complex logistics, how to feed hundreds of patients, how to secure medical supplies, how to organize staff, and they were doing it well, which must have been both exhilarating and terrifying. Exhilarating because they were finally using their minds, finally being useful, finally doing something that mattered. Terrifying because it meant that everything they'd been told about women's capabilities was a lie. If women could manage military hospitals, why could they not manage businesses? If women could make medical decisions, why could they not practice medicine professionally? If women could organize complex operations, why could they not hold positions of authority? The cage was not just opening, it was being blown apart by the war. But I do not want to romanticize this too much, because while some aristocratic women were discovering new capabilities, they were also experiencing unprecedented loss. The casualty rates in World War I were catastrophic. An entire generation of young men was being destroyed in the trenches of France and Belgium, and these women, these mothers and wives and sisters, they were receiving the telegrams. They were reading the names on casualty lists. They were attending funeral after funeral after funeral. Imagine being a mother of 3 sons. All 3 enlist. One dies in 1915, another in 1916. The third comes home in 1918, but he is so damaged by shell shock, what we now call PTSD, that he is barely recognizable as the boy who left. This happened to countless families. Entire family lines were wiped out. Ancient aristocratic names disappeared. because all the male heirs died in the war. And the women survived. They kept going. They had to. There was no other choice. There is a particular kind of strength that comes from having no other options. When you cannot break down because people depend on you, when you cannot give up because there is too much work to be done, you discover reserves of endurance you never knew you had. But let me talk about something else that happened during the war. Something that got less attention but was equally revolutionary. Fashion changed. I know that might sound trivial compared to everything else we've been discussing, but fashion is never just about clothes. Fashion is about power and identity and what society expects from bodies. The S-bend corset, gone. Women could not work in hospitals or factories or farms while wearing those torture devices. So the corset loosened. Then it disappeared almost entirely for many women. Skirts got shorter, not scandalously short by our standards, but shorter. They went from dragging on the ground to showing ankles. Women started wearing simpler clothes, more practical clothes, and once women experienced the freedom of being able to breathe properly, of being able to move without restriction, of being able to put on their own clothes without needing a maid to lace them up, they were not going back. The fashion industry tried to reintroduce restrictive clothing after the war. It did not work. Women refused. That is power. That is women collectively saying, no, we are not doing this anymore. The war also forced changes in how society viewed women's work outside the home. With so many men gone to fight, women filled their positions, women drove ambulances, women worked in munitions factories, dangerous work where accidents could kill you instantly. Women worked on farms, women took over businesses their husbands had run. Women entered the civil service in large numbers, and they did these jobs competently. There was no more pretending that women were too delicate or too stupid or too emotional for these roles. The evidence was right there. Women were keeping the entire home front running while men were at war. Some of the class barriers started to break down too. In hospitals and factories, aristocratic women were working alongside working class women. Not as equals, let us not pretend the class system disappeared, but in ways that would have been unthinkable before the war. An aristocratic woman who volunteered as a nurse might work under the supervision of a working-class head nurse who had years of professional experience. That aristocratic woman had to take orders from someone she would have considered socially inferior before the war. And you know what? Many of them learned to respect that working-class nurse's expertise. They learned that competence matters more than birth. It did not eliminate classism, but it created cracks in the system, and through those cracks, change could seep in. Now I want to come back to Queen Marie of Romania, because her story illustrates something important about how the war created opportunities for women to exercise power in ways that had been completely closed to them before. After the war ended, Marie went to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. She went as an unofficial diplomat for Romania, trying to secure favourable terms for her country. And she was brilliant at it. She met with world leaders. She negotiated. She used her charm and intelligence and political skill to advocate for Romanian interests. One story about her at the peace conference has become famous. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States initially refused to meet with her. He was too busy, he said. So Marie invited him to breakfast at her hotel at 7 in the morning. She figured he could not claim to be too busy at 7 in the morning. Wilson agreed, probably thinking it would be a short ceremonial meeting. Marie kept him talking for over an hour. She made her case for Romania. She was persuasive, well-informed, strategic. By the end of that breakfast, Wilson was much more sympathetic to the Romanian position. Marie later wrote in her diary that she had given her country a living face, that she had brought forward the needs and aspirations of her people. And she had. She had done real diplomatic work, work that had real consequences for her country's future. But here is the thing. This was only possible because the war had broken the old rules. Before the war, a woman doing diplomatic work would have been scandalous, improper, impossible. But after the war, after women had proven themselves capable of so much, it became not easy, not accepted by everyone, but possible. The war did not liberate women. Let me be clear about that. It did not suddenly create equality. When the war ended, there was enormous pressure for women to go back to their pre-war roles, to leave the jobs they had taken during the war, so men could have them back, to return to being decorative and domestic, and many women were forced to do exactly that. Women who had supported themselves during the war, who had found purpose and identity in their work, were pushed back into economic dependence. It was heartbreaking. But something fundamental had changed. Women had seen what was possible. They had tasted freedom and capability and purpose. They had proven, to themselves if not to everyone else, that all the limitations they had been told were natural and inevitable were actually just social construction, arbitrary rules made by people in power to keep other people powerless. And once you know that, once you have seen through the lie, you cannot unsee it. You can be forced to comply outwardly, but internally you know the truth. There is a phrase that historians use when talking about the impact of World War I on women. The war to end all wars ended, but the revolution for women had just begun. The suffragettes' fight for the vote was vindicated. British women got limited suffrage in 1918, full suffrage in 1928. American women got the vote in 1920. The movement spread across the Western world. But more than that, the war had demonstrated that the entire social system of the Edwardian era, the rigid class structure, the gender roles, the assumption that aristocracy was naturally superior and women naturally inferior, was built on sand. When real pressure was applied, when the world faced an existential crisis, all those beautiful rules and traditions turned out to be completely inadequate. Women saved the home front during World War I. They kept societies functioning. They proved their worth in ways that could not be denied or explained away. And the aristocratic world, the world of la belle époque, of S-bend corsets and marriage markets and mistresses and country estates. That world died in the trenches along with the young men. It tried to resurrect itself after the war, tried to pretend that everything could go back to normal. But it was already dead. People just had not buried it yet. In our final part, we need to bring all of this together. We need to talk about what we can learn from these women's stories, what their suffering and their strength and their eventual triumph can teach us about power, about oppression, about resilience, about change. We need to reflect on why it took a war that killed millions to finally break the cage that had imprisoned women for centuries. And we need to ask ourselves, what cages exist today? What beautiful lies are we still believing? What will it take for us to break free? One more part, one more piece of this story, and then we will understand why these women, these aristocratic women who had everything and nothing, matter so much to history and to us. Stay with me for the conclusion. So here we are, at the end of our journey through one of history's most beautiful lies. We have spent hours together, walking through the gilded corridors of La Belle Époque, and I hope by now you understand why I wanted to tell you this story. Because these women, these aristocratic women who had mansions and jewels and every material comfort, they were prisoners, and their wealth did not save them. Their privilege did not protect them. Their beauty did not set them free. In the end, it took a war that killed 17 million people to finally break the cage that had held them captive. Let me ask you something. When you think about the early 1900s now, after everything we have discussed, what do you see? Do you still see the romantic image of elegant ladies in beautiful gowns attending glittering balls? Or do you see something else? Do you see Matilda burning to death because she was afraid of her father? Do you see Consuelo locked in her room until she agreed to marry a stranger? Do you see women's ribs breaking inside their corsets? Do you see mothers dying in childbirth over and over again? Do you see desperate women buying arsenic? Do you see the beautiful paintings of drowned women and understand now what they really represented? I hope you see both. I hope you can hold both truths in your mind at the same time, that the beauty was real and the suffering was real, and they existed side by side, two faces of the same system. Because here is what I think is the most important lesson from this entire story. Oppression does not always look like chains and dungeons. Sometimes it looks like silk gowns and diamond tiaras. Sometimes it looks like luxury and privilege. Sometimes the cage is made of gold and the bars are invisible, but that does not make them any less real. These aristocratic women had everything society said women should want. They had security, they had comfort, they had status, but they did not have freedom. They did not have autonomy. They did not have control over their own bodies, their own futures, their own lives. And the system that trapped them was designed to make that seem normal, natural, inevitable. They were taught from birth that this was just how things were, that women were meant to be decorative and obedient, that their purpose was to marry well and produce heirs, that their suffering was noble and their sacrifice was beautiful. The system convinced them that the cage was actually a palace, that their chains were actually jewelry, and many of them believed it. They internalized these messages so completely that they fought to maintain the very system that oppressed them. They became gatekeepers, enforcing the rules on younger women, punishing anyone who stepped out of line. This is what oppression does. It makes people complicit in their own captivity. It convinces them that the cage is for their own protection, that without it they would be vulnerable, unsafe, lost. But some women saw through the lie. The suffragettes saw it. The new women saw it. The ones who fought back, who demanded more, who refused to accept that this was all there could be. They saw the cage for what it was, and they were called hysterical, unfeminine, dangerous, unnatural, because challenging the system is always portrayed as madness by the people who benefit from the system. But they were not mad, they were seeing clearly. And their clarity was threatening because if women started questioning why they had to wear corsets that broke their ribs, they might also start questioning why they could not vote, why they could not own property, why they could not leave abusive marriages, why they could not control their own fertility. One question leads to another. One crack in the foundation spreads. This is why systems of oppression work so hard to prevent people from asking questions. Because once you start pulling on one thread, the whole tapestry might unravel. World War I unraveled it. Not because anyone planned it that way, not because the war was fought for women's liberation, but because the war created a crisis that was bigger than social convention. Survival mattered more than propriety. Winning the war mattered more than maintaining gender roles, and once women had proven they could do the work, once they had shown they were capable of running hospitals and factories and farms, once they had demonstrated their competence in ways that could not be denied, the old arguments fell apart. You cannot tell women they are too emotional to vote after they have spent 4 years making life and death medical decisions. You cannot tell them they are too weak to work after they have done back-breaking labour in munitions factories. You cannot tell them they need male protection after they have protected and sustained the entire home front while men were away. The evidence was overwhelming. The lie was exposed. But, and this is crucial, exposing the lie did not automatically create equality. The war ended in 1918. Women in Britain got limited suffrage in 1918, full suffrage in 1928. But it took decades more for them to get anything approaching equal rights, and we are still fighting for true equality today more than a century later. Because systems of oppression do not disappear just because you prove they are unjust. They adapt, They find new justifications. They create new barriers. The cage gets redesigned, but it does not go away entirely. After World War I, women were pressured to give up their wartime jobs so men could have them back. They were told that their time of usefulness was over, that they should return to being wives and mothers. Some women were forced to comply because they had no economic alternatives. Others fought to keep their positions and were vilified for it. The 1920s brought some freedoms, shorter skirts, looser morals, the flapper era, but it also brought backlash, enormous backlash. People who were terrified by the social changes the war had brought about worked to roll them back, to restore the old order, to put women back in their place. It did not entirely work. You cannot put the genie back in the bottle. Once people have tasted freedom, they do not forget it. But progress is never linear. It is always contested. Every step forward is met with resistance from people who prefer the old ways. So what can we learn from these aristocratic women and their struggles? What relevance do their stories have for us today? First, I think we learn to question beautiful lies, to look beneath the surface of things that seem perfect and glamorous and ask, who is suffering to create this beauty? Whose labour is invisible? Whose pain is being ignored? The Instagram perfect life, the having it all narrative. The idea that if you just work hard enough and make the right choices, you can have career and family and beauty and wealth and happiness all at once. These are the modern versions of La Belle Époque. They look gorgeous on the surface. And underneath, people are struggling, burning out, breaking themselves, trying to meet impossible standards. I'm not saying we should reject beauty or ambition or wanting nice things. I am saying we should be aware of the cost. We should ask who is paying it. Second, we learn that privilege is complicated. These aristocratic women had enormous privilege compared to working-class women of their time. They had wealth and status and comfort that most people could only dream of. But they were still oppressed in fundamental ways. Privilege does not make you immune to oppression. It just changes what form the oppression takes. Understanding this helps us avoid simplistic thinking. It helps us recognize that people can be both privileged and oppressed at the same time. That having advantages in some areas does not mean you have power in all areas. That we need to think about these intersections carefully and with nuance. Third, we learn that change is possible but never easy. The suffragettes fought for decades. They were arrested, tortured, mocked, dismissed. Emily Davison died for the cause, and they still did not achieve full equality, but they moved the needle. They created change that made more change possible. Every right we have today, every freedom we enjoy, exists because someone fought for it. Because someone was willing to be uncomfortable, to be ridiculed, to sacrifice their safety and their comfort, and sometimes their lives. Progress requires courage. It requires persistence. It requires being willing to be unpopular and to keep fighting even when it seems hopeless. Fourth, we learn that systems are powerful but not invincible. The Edwardian social system seemed eternal. It had existed in various forms for centuries. It was backed by law, by religion, by tradition, by the most powerful institutions in society. It seemed impossible to change, and then a war happened, and within a few years that system was shattered. Not completely, remnants of it persist today, but fundamentally altered. The impossible became possible. This should give us hope. The systems that oppress us today, patriarchy, racism, economic inequality, environmental destruction, they seem overwhelming, unchangeable, too big to fight, but they are not eternal. They are human constructions. What humans have built, humans can change. It will not be easy. It will not be quick. It might take a crisis to create the conditions for fundamental change. But change is possible, and finally we learn to honour the women who came before us. to remember their struggles, to recognize that the freedoms we take for granted were earned through their suffering and their courage. We can vote because of them. We can own property because of them. We can choose our own partners, control our own fertility, pursue education and careers, all because women fought for these rights when doing so could destroy their lives. We stand on their shoulders. Every woman who has ever benefited from any of these rights owes a debt to the women who fought for them, and the best way to honour that debt is to keep fighting, to push for more progress, to ensure that future generations have even more freedom than we do. Because the work is not done, the cage is bigger now, less obvious, but it still exists. Women still face violence and discrimination and pressure to conform to impossible standards. The specifics have changed, but the underlying dynamics, power, control, the attempt to limit women's autonomy, they persist. So what do we do with this knowledge? What do we do with these stories? We remember, we bear witness. We refuse to let these women's suffering be forgotten, or romanticized or sanitized. We tell the truth about what their lives were really like, and we ask ourselves, what are we accepting as natural and inevitable that is actually just another form of the cage? What beautiful lies are we believing? What would it take for us to break free? I started this story by telling you about Matilda, burning to death at 18 because she was afraid to disappoint her father. I want to end by thinking about all the Matildas, all the young women throughout history who have died, literally or metaphorically, because they were trapped in systems that valued their obedience more than their happiness, their appearance more than their autonomy, their sacrifice more than their survival. Their stories matter, not because they were aristocrats, not because they were wealthy or beautiful or well-born, but because they were human beings who suffered under an unjust system, and their suffering and their resistance and their eventual liberation, incomplete as it was, teaches us something essential about power and freedom and change. The cage was real, the suffering was real, but the breaking was real too, and that is what gives me hope. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for listening to these women's stories, for sitting with the discomfort and the darkness, for thinking critically about the beautiful surface and the ugly reality beneath. I hope this story has changed how you think about history. I hope it has made you question the narratives we tell about the past and the present. I hope it has inspired you to look more carefully at the cages that still exist and to think about how we might break them. These women deserved better than they got, but their struggles were not in vain. They created cracks in the foundation. They proved that change was possible. They handed us tools that we are still using today. The best way to honor them is to keep using those tools, to keep pushing, to keep questioning, to keep fighting for a world where no one has to choose between safety and freedom, where no one has to break themselves to fit into a cage, no matter how golden it might be. And if you have stayed with me through this entire story, through all the 12 parts, through more than 2 hours of history and heartbreak and hard truths, thank you. Truly, your attention, your willingness to engage with difficult material, your openness to seeing the past in a new way, that matters. That is how stories like this create change. One listener at a time, one person reconsidering what they thought they knew, one mind opening to new possibilities. I will be back soon with another story, another journey into the parts of history that do not make it into the textbooks, another opportunity to learn from the people who came before us, who struggled and suffered and survived and sometimes triumphed. Until then, I hope you carry these women with you. I hope you remember them, and I hope their stories make you think differently about the world we live in now. Sleep well, dream of cages breaking, dream of freedom, and I will see you in the next story.